What I'm going to try to do as an astronomer in the next hour is give you 4 different segments of evidence and why I think we can securely conclude that extraterrestrials have not visited our solar system. And the 4 topics I'll be discussing would be what I would call the heavenly body problem, the problem of trying to find a heavenly body on which life can exist, the origin of life problem, and the more significant problem of trying to find a home or an origin for intelligent life. And then in the case where you might conclude that maybe there's a supernatural transcendent being that preferred to create more than one species of physical intelligent life, what about the space travel problem, the problem of that species being able to come to our planetary system from another planetary system? So that's a quick outline of what you will be hearing. The heavenly body problem is a subject that I've addressed in some detail in this book, The Creator and the Cosmos. It's now in its 3rd edition, and you can go to our website for the latest research efforts. By the way, at our reasons.org website, we give you every day a new scientific discovery that adds more weight to the evidence that there is a Creator God that's responsible for human beings being here on planet Earth. But the heavenly body problem, we're faced with 5 issues. Not any old galaxy will do. It takes a very special kind of galaxy to harbor life, and you need a very special kind of star. Jupiter is critical. Without Jupiter being the right mass and the right position, the right orbital characteristics, life would not be possible on our planet. Of course, you need a specially designed planet, and the moon must be just right. In fact, a book in my library is titled "What If the Moon Didn't Exist?" Over 300 pages of the fine-tuning of the moon that's necessary to ensure life on our planet Earth. Now, with respect to the galaxy, you heard earlier there's almost 1 trillion galaxies in the observable universe, but it takes a medium-large size galaxy. If the galaxy is too large, it will generate a black hole of such mass that will radiate the entire galaxy, making the whole galaxy uninhabitable. But if the galaxy is too small, it will be gravitationally torn apart by its neighboring galaxies. So you want a medium-large galaxy. And it must be spiral in structure. Only 6% of the galaxies in the universe are spirals. It is these spiral galaxies that are able to sustain ongoing star formation for many billions of years. And about 12 billion years of star formation activity is necessary in order to build up the elements that are critical for the existence of life. So most of the galaxies observed in the universe, star formation shut down much too long ago for them to be candidates. You must make sure you have the right galactic neighbors. What's exceptional about our Milky Way galaxy, it exists in what's called the local group. 24 galaxies, only 2 of which are medium-large, ours and the Andromeda galaxy. The others are dwarf galaxies, and unlike other clusters of galaxies, these 24 galaxies are rather far apart from one another, which means collisions between galaxies are relatively rare, and when they do take place, it's either our galaxy or Andromeda gobbling up a relatively tiny galaxy. Incidentally, some gobbling up of dwarf galaxies is necessary to sustain star formation long enough for life to be possible. But the real exceptional nature of the local group is its location. It's on the extreme outer fringe of the Virgo supercluster, and therefore there are no neighboring giant galaxies that are going to gravitationally break up our galaxy. We're too far away from the Virgo supercluster. Over 99% of all the galaxies in the universe find themselves in these clusters of galaxies where the galaxy density is simply too high to permit the existence of life. Incidentally, our position in the local group also gives us a unique capacity to see the universe. If we were anywhere else in the universe, you look out the night sky, your view would be blocked by one gigantic nearby galaxy. But because of where we are, we have a window where we can actually see out to those those 1 trillion galaxies that are out there, observe them, and actually learn some things about the special nature of our universe and the home which we have. The medium between the galaxies, what's called the intracluster medium, is critical for life within a galaxy. The movement of the galaxy with respect to that medium sets up a pressure which determines the rate at which stars will form throughout the galaxy's history. And there are 3 factors that must be carefully fine-tuned in order to extend the star formation over a sufficient period of time where you could get a star like the Sun and a planet like the Earth. So we need a special galaxy. Now, in terms of our solar system, the Sun is recognized as a heavyweight champion for stars of its age. It's got the richest abundance of metals, heavier than hydrogen helium, for stars that are 4 to 5 billion years old. Why? Well, astronomers now understand that our star had the good fortune of forming immediately adjacent to both a type 1 supernova and a type 2 supernova. You say, why the 2 types? Well, the type 1 supernova makes about half of the heavy metals that are necessary to sustain advanced life, but only half. The other half are made by a type 2 supernova. Matter of fact, if you go to our website next week, I'm going to post a brand new discovery that documents that it takes a particularly rare kind of type 1 supernova in order to get the critical heavy elements necessary for advanced. A brand new discovery which shows us that we really are looking at a truly exceptional birth for our solar system, where the supernova do not form so close as to obliterate our solar system, but not so far away that we don't get adequate enrichment of these elements. And of course, supernovae explode about once every 100 years per galaxy. You can see what's called the amazing coincidence here. You've got just the right kind of type 1 supernova and the right kind of type 2 supernova exploding at the same time in the same location, so that we can get this idealized enrichment of the solar nebula without destroying the solar nebula. Now, as if that's not enough, we recognize that one element essential for advanced life fluorine is only made in a rare kind of a white dwarf binary. That white dwarf binary also must have been actively expelling fluorine into the solar nebula at just the same time that this type 1 and type 2 supernova were erupting. Now, in terms of the orbit of the Sun around the center of our galaxy, we recognize that it has a very small z-axis displacement. Now, the other stars orbiting the center of our galaxy, they typically go up and down considerably as they orbit around the center of our galaxy. And as they go up and down, they get exposed to the radiation from the black hole at the center of our galaxy. Our Sun is exceptional in that it doesn't go up and down hardly at all, and therefore remains protected against the radiation from that central black hole. In fact, it's the only star that we can see in our solar neighborhood that has this tiny z-axis displacement, but that's critical for life existing here on planet Earth. The distance that we are between the spiral arms. One of the unusual things about our star, it's located almost exactly halfway between 2 spiral arms. Good news for advanced life, because if you approach a spiral arm, you will be exposed to radiation that would be deadly for advanced life. You'll be exposed to the gravity of supergiant stars that would disturb the orbit of a planet like Earth going around that Sun, and you would also be exposed to intense ultraviolet radiation from those supergiant stars. But we're located halfway between 2 spiral arms. We're also halfway out from the center of our galaxy to the halo of our galaxy. And we're located at what's called the co-rotation distance. The spiral structure of our galaxy has a particular rotation rate, but the stars revolve around the center of our galaxy at a different rate than the spiral structure rotates, which means that your star inevitably will be caught up into one of the spiral arms unless you're at what's called the co-rotation distance. That one distance from the center of the galaxy where a star would revolve around the center at exactly the same rate that the spiral structure rotates. That's where our star happens to reside. Now, in terms of the Earth, The Earth is the right size in terms of its mass and diameter to retain lots of water, but not too much water. One of the problems that astronomers face in trying to model our solar system is trying to figure out why our planet has so little carbon and so little water. We should have a water world environment in planet Earth. We don't, and it's necessary to very carefully fine-tune the gravity of planet Earth so it loses a tiny amount of water to outer space. Water which is replaced by a small amount of comets colliding with the Earth. But if it were any bigger, we'd have a carbon or a problem with too much carbon or too much water. So it's just the right size. It's just the right distance from our sun. If we were to move the Earth 0.5% closer to the sun, you'd have a runaway boiling of the water. The frozen water, the liquid water, would transform into steam. Why? Because moving a little bit closer to the sun, the Earth would absorb more heat from the sun. That extra heat would cause more water vapor to evaporate. That water vapor traps more heat from the sun. It's a greenhouse gas, and this becomes a runaway situation. So move the Earth just 0.5% closer, 500,000 miles closer to the sun, and you'd have problems. You'd also have a problem if you move it 0.5% farther away, because now the Earth would receive less heat, and receiving less heat means that more snow will fall, and snow is reflective. And so that will radiate more heat away to outer space, which is going to cool the planet more, which means more snow falls, and so you get a runaway freeze-up. Moving it just 500,000 miles farther away, our planet's water would be transformed into the solid state. For advanced life to be possible, we need water roughly equal amounts between the vapor, the liquid, and the ice, and having the right distance makes sure that happens. Now, when I was a graduate student working with the likes of Carl Sagan and others on trying to model how a planetary system would develop, one of the things we noted, both as professors and students, is what we call the atmosphere anomaly of planet Earth. This atmosphere anomaly is as follows: that you would expect that the greater the distance a planet is from its star, the thicker its atmosphere. Why? Because the farther away you are, the colder it is. And so with being colder, the planet will retain a heavier atmosphere. Also, the greater the gravity of a planet, the heavier the atmosphere it will retain. Now, all the planets in the solar system have exactly what the physics would predict in terms of their atmospheric covering. Jupiter would have a very thick atmosphere because it's so massive and so far away from the sun. Mars has very little atmosphere, mainly because it has such a small gravity that it can't retain much of an atmosphere. Venus is closer to the sun, a little less massive than planet Earth, and it has an atmosphere 40 times as dense. So by this calculation, we astronomers would expect that planet Earth would have an atmosphere 100 times as thick as what we observe. And if that were the case, life would be forever impossible on our planet. How is it that our planet had its atmosphere reduced from 100 times the pressure that we observe? Well, astronomers now recognize that our planet was blessed with a very carefully designed collision when it was only 70 million years old. When the astronauts went to the moon, they brought back moon rocks, and one of the things they noted is that the moon rocks are younger than the Earth rocks. And they also noted they were of lighter composition. That immediately told them that the moon and the Earth did not form together. The moon must have formed later than the Earth had formed. And having a lighter composition told them that it must have been an exceptional collision event that led to the formation of the moon. The other thing they noted by putting laser reflectors on the moon is that the moon spirals away from us at about 5 centimeters per year. And you trace that back in time, it puts the moon much closer to the Earth in the distant past. Well, you can read about this in such journals as Nature and the Astrophysical Journal. Astronomers have now been able to determine that when the Earth was 70 million years old, it received a collision from a planet the mass of Mars. And as Mars-sized planet hit the Earth, not head-on, that would have obliterated both bodies. It wasn't a grazing blow, it was between grazing and head-on. And that collision resulted in a transfer of all the heavy element material from the Mars-sized planet into the Earth, and then a transfer of the light element material in both the Earth and the collider into a debris cloud around the Earth. And that debris cloud shortly condensed to make the Moon, and the Moon began to spiral away. Now, what that collision did is it blew off the Earth's primordial atmosphere, and the Earth wound up having a much thinner atmosphere replace that primordial thick atmosphere. So by this means, Earth now had an atmosphere suitable for the support of life. It also meant the Earth received enough heavy elements, heavy metals critical for the support of advanced life, and particularly uranium and thorium, long-lived radiometric elements that could drive plate tectonic activity and the dynamo in the interior of the Earth, which is critical for dealing with what's called the faint sun paradox. The sun, as all stars, gets brighter and brighter as every year goes by. You've been noticing that it's about 15% brighter today than it was 3.8 billion years ago when life was first created on planet Earth. And what's been happening is that the Earth's atmosphere has been perfectly compensating for the increase in the solar luminosity, in the sense that the creation of life on planet Earth has the property that it removes carbon dioxide and water from the atmosphere, those are greenhouse gases, and converts them into sugars, starches, and fats that plate tectonics buries into the crust of the Earth. And also, life works in such a way as to convert the silicate land masses into sand and carbonates, and those too get buried into the crust of the Earth. And by carefully creating just the right life forms at just the right time and just the right sequence and abundance, a creator can carefully compensate for the increase in the solar luminosity by reducing the efficiency of the Earth's greenhouse gases. The Moon plays a role in this. I mentioned that book a little while ago, What If the Moon Didn't Exist? The Earth-Moon system has been called by many astronomers a double planet, because you've got this small planet orbited by a single gigantic moon. But it takes that orbital arrangement to stabilize the rotation of planet Earth. All the other planets, like Mars, have a rotation axis that tilts like this, back and forth. Planet Earth is nice and stable because of the gravity of the Moon, the tidal torques operating on the Earth and its rotation rate. Now, also the Earth-Moon system operates to disturb the resonances caused by the other planets in our solar system that would work to disrupt the orbit of the Earth and take it out of the life support zone. Now, what we've done at Reasons to Believe for the last several years is try to conservatively calculate the probability that you would have a galaxy of the right size. I believe it's much less than 10%, but we'll go at 10%. 6% of the galaxies are spiral. You need to have it located far away from a galaxy cluster, and then you want to make sure that the star is the right distance from the galactic center. And by the way, there's hundreds of parameters in our list. I'm just going to give you a little bit of a flavor for some of these characteristics. It must be a bachelor star, and the star needs to be born fairly late in the history of the universe. The early born stars would have the wrong chemistry for life. The star must be middle-aged, even for bacterial life, and must be incredibly fine-tuned if we're talking advanced life. The window is only about 100,000 years wide. Must have the right metallicity. I won't bore you with all the details. Some of them have to do with the solar system, and others with the physics and the geophysics of the atmosphere, the crust of the Earth, and life on the Earth. What I will do, this is all posted on our website at reasons.org. You can see the entire list there, where we actually give you a formal calculation of the probability of finding a planet or a moon anywhere in the entire observable universe that would have the required characteristics, not just for life as we know it, but any conceivable life form, because one thing chemists have been able to contribute to this debate, if you want astronomers, you've got to make them a carbon. Silicon-based life simply won't permit the necessary complexity, likewise boron won't. Carbon is the only element in the chart of elements that can sustain the necessary complexity. So that's the only assumption I bring to bear here, is that we're talking carbon-based life. Now, some of these characteristics, you could argue, are dependent on other characteristics in my list. Therefore, I've tried to very generously allow for these dependency factors. Some of them are required to be kept constant for long periods of time. That reduces the probability. But our current list posted on our website, we're going to be adding a bunch more in the next few weeks. You'll see 202 parameters listed with a probability, given these dependency factors and longevity requirements, of 1 chance in 10 to the 239. That's 239 zeros after the 1. Now, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, I had Carl Sagan when I was in graduate school as a professor for a little while, and he was aware of these kinds of probabilities, but his argument was, well, after all, there may be an enormous number of planets in the universe. Well, in fact, we astronomers note that our galaxy is the most planet-rich galaxy that we observe, and it has a richness of 2%, namely 2% of the stars in our galaxy, at least in our neighborhood, would have planets. Chances are that percentage is a lot less in the globular clusters and the galactic bulge where most of the stars exist. But I'm willing to grant Carl Sagan his most optimistic estimate, and it's the most optimistic estimate I've seen anywhere in the astronomical literature, that there may be as many as 10 billion trillion planets in the entire observable universe. I think that's at least 100 times too high, but I'm willing to grant an extra factor of 100. When you throw that 10 to the 22 in, it simply reduces the probability down to 1 chance in 10 to the 217 of finding one body anywhere in the entire observable universe with the capacity to support any conceivable physical life form, a bacterium, let alone a human being. Now, to put this number in some context, there's only 10 to the 79 protons and neutrons in the entire observable universe. Or to put it another way, every one of you sitting here in this room has 1 chance in 10 to the 80th of being killed by a sudden reversal in the second law of thermodynamics before I finish my speech. So what we realize here is the probability of finding another planet or moon with the capacity to support life is far more remote than the chance that you'll be killed by a sudden reversal in the second law of thermodynamics. Dr. Fuzz Rana, our staff biochemist, and myself will be coming with a book on the origin of life. It's the first book on the origin of life where we actually use a predictive model approach. What we do is we put our biblical creation model side by side with the naturalist model for the origin of life, and in each chapter we make specific predictions on what scientists in the next 12 to 18 months should discover in their present research. And by that means anyone reading the book within a year to a year and a half will be able to establish whose predictions came true and whose predictions did not come true. And we were careful to run our predictions by people who take the opposite view we do, and they agreed with us that the predictions we put down were indeed valid predictions from their naturalist perspective. But we're arguing that there is no possibility for a naturalist interpretation of the origin of life for the following reasons. We have what's called the time-scale problem. Now, I'll just give you 2 examples, but it would apply to other bodies within the universe. The first is planet Earth. We know that planet Earth was subjected to what's called the late heavy bombardment 3.85 billion years ago. A bombardment of asteroids and comets that was so intense it would have volatilized all the water on planet Earth, turned it to steam, and would have turned the crust of the Earth into a molten state. Obviously not a suitable environment for the origin of life. And it took about 50 million years for the planet to cool down enough where you would have the chemistry that would allow the metabolic reactions necessary for life to proceed. And yet we have tools based on carbon-13 to carbon-12 analysis that establishes that life was abundant on Earth as early as 3.8 billion years ago. Well, you can kind of do the math. 3.85 minus 0.05 gives you 3.8. Up until 3.8 billion years ago, the Earth could not sustain life. And yet life is abundant on planet Earth 3.8 billion years ago. What's 3.8 minus 3.8? That tells us the origin of life took place in virtually zero geologic time. Now, in terms of Mars, there's another example we can give. There is some speculation that Mars in its early history might have been warm and wet because maybe 3.8, 3.9 billion years ago, it would have had enough water in its environment. Mars would lose water fairly quickly to outer space because of its low gravity, but when it's very young, there might be water there, there might be carbon dioxide in great abundance, and that could set up a greenhouse effect that would make Mars warm enough that you could sustain metabolic reactions. But the problem with Mars is that you would need so much carbon dioxide and water to make the planet the right temperature for these metabolic reactions that that water and carbon dioxide will instantly react and make carbonic acid, and that will turn into carbonates. And indeed, as astronomers examine the chemistry of the crust of Mars, we see that it's loaded with carbonates that date back to 3.8 billion years. So it tells us that there was this rapid transformation of whatever carbon and water was in the environment into these carbonates. And there again, you can do the math. Mars, by the way, was subjected to the same late heavy bombardment as planet Earth was, namely conditions on Mars would have been unsuitable for life because of that bombardment until 3.8 billion years ago. But 3.8 billion years ago is when the planet became cold and dry and has remained in that cold, dry state ever since. So if you're trying to make the origin of life happen on Mars, you again have zero time, and I could play out the scenario for any other possible solar system or extrasolar system body, you get the same answer. Now, in terms of planet Earth, the scenario for the origin of life from a naturalist perspective was we'd have enormous amounts of time and a vast soup. Well, we now know there's no time. But astronomers and geophysicists have also discovered there is no soup. Carbon-12 to carbon-13 analysis gives you a different signature for postbiotics than it does prebiotics. Naturalist origin of life scenario requires that you've got this vast supply of prebiotics that self-assemble into the first life form. However, when we make these carbon-12 to carbon-13 measurements, we discover there are no prebiotics. No prebiotics ever existed on the face of the Earth. All the carbonaceous material we measure is the result of the decay of once living material. In other words, it's all postbiotic. There are no prebiotics ever existing on the face of the Earth. Now, the physicist jumps in and says, we know why. It's because of the oxygen ultraviolet paradox. If you have any kind of oxygen, either in the ocean or in the atmosphere, even at very low abundance levels, that oxygen will terminate prebiotic reactions. On the other hand, if you have no oxygen, ultraviolet radiation from the sun will stream in, and that will terminate the prebiotic reaction. So it's a lose-lose situation from a naturalist perspective. If you got oxygen, that will shut down the prebiotic chemistry. If you don't have oxygen, the ultraviolet radiation comes through, and that shuts down the chemistry. Now, my friends in the naturalist origin of life camp said, well, we recognize that, and of course that would also operate on Mars, so that again would be another strike against a Martian origin of life. But they said, how about Europa? Because in Europa we're talking about life that is considerably below the surface of that planet, and what's presumed to be a liquid water ocean underneath the surface ice of Europa, and therefore we're not talking photosynthetic life, we're talking life that would be protected from the ultraviolet radiation, but here you run into what's called the oxidants paradox. Now, we do have deep underwater life on planet Earth at the steam vents, However, it's not the chemicals in the steam vents that drive the metabolic reactions. Rather, they are the oxidants generated on the surface of the water getting dissolved in the ocean and coming down to the steam vents. Therefore, an origin of life scenario in Europa, for example, requires that there must be a mechanism to take the oxidants that would be produced on the surface of Europa and get them through the surface ice down to what we presume is a liquid water ocean below. But they have found craters on Europa that establish that the ice thickness at a minimum is 20 kilometers thick. And if it's 20 kilometers thick, there is no pathway for the oxidants to get down into the ocean below and feed the metabolic reactions. So in that sense, NASA can save a ton of money. They don't need to drill a little hole through the ice and send a little robot down there with a movie camera looking for bacteria. The oxidants paradox tells us that that life can't be there. The oxidants can't get down. And by the way, those oxidants would also stop the pathway for prebiotic chemistry. So if you got the oxidants there before the life form, that will stop the prebiotic situation from happening. Non-bioactive contaminants, I'm going to have to really rush through this. Fortunately, this will be covered in some of my books, is that the presumption in origin of life research is that you always can keep out the stuff that's going to get in the way of the reaction. Of course, that's not realistic. The non-bioactive contaminants are far more numerous than the prebiotics. There's the homochirality problem, the fact that life is made up of left-handed amino acids and right-handed nucleotide sugars, and we see nowhere in the universe where we can get the necessary physics operating to drive that homochirality where all the molecules would be driven to one sign or the other. What was proposed once was that you could get that next to a neutron star or a black hole, but the Condon-Kuhn rule tells us that that would only work if indeed the radiation coming up from that black hole or neutron star is monochromatic of one wavelength only. And of course, there's nowhere in the universe where we see monochromatic circularly polarized light. The phosphorus problem, planet Earth's crust is the richest that we know of any body in the universe in terms of phosphorus density, namely 1/10 of 1%. More typical is 1/1000th of a percent, but even 1/10 of a percent gives us so little phosphorus that we really can't explain the origin of life. In fact, there was an article submitted to Science called The Miracle of Phosphorus, the point that phosphorus is so rare, and yet in life molecules it is so abundant. The rarity of the building blocks, I'm just going to let you kind of look at this, but let me take it down to the bottom line. Genomics now tells us that the first conceivable life form must be comprised of at least 1,500 gene products. And 1,500 gene products means that if we were to take that simplest life form and break all the chemical bonds, then keep it under ideal conditions to foster reassembly, prevent any contaminants from coming in, and prevent any of the good stuff from leaving, you'd still have to wait 10 to the 100 billion years to have a 95% probability of those atoms putting themselves back together to make the simplest life form. And of course, the universe is only 10 to the 10 years old. So the universe is 10 to the 99 billion, 999,920 times too young to permit any possibility for a naturalist origin of life. In terms of what advanced life needs, it needs a whole lot more than the bacteria, which are the first life forms. Number one, you need lots of radiometric elements to drive the plate tectonics that's necessary to deal with the faint sun paradox. You also need an electric motor in the core of the Earth that runs as long as as the plate tectonics does on planet Earth. And I've written about this on our reasons.org website. You actually have to fine-tune over 20 particular geophysical parameters on planet Earth in order to get the dynamo to run long enough and the radiometric elements to provide the heat source to drive the plate tectonic activity. The stable surface temperature temperature. The sun, as recently there's a discovery in Sudbury, Canada, where they were measuring the total amount of neutrinos coming out of the sun. That particular experiment, published a year ago, and again you can see our reasons.org website for a write-up on it, shows us that for the past 50,000 years, the sun has been in an exceptionally stable luminosity phase, very little variation, and will remain so for the next 50,000 years. But this tells us that we have a narrow window, only 100,000 years wide, in which the temperature is stable enough to sustain advanced life where they can develop a civilization and a technology. If you're talking, Stone Age type situation, you can get by with less, but if you're talking technology and civilization, the demand is a lot higher. Of course, you need lots of free oxygen, limited amounts of carbon and water. You don't want a water world or too much carbon. The air pressure must be fixed because advanced life capable of technology must have an efficient respiratory system, and if you vary the air pressure by more than a factor of 3, that shuts down. We have what are called vital poisons. By the way, if you're taking chromium supplements as part of your nutritional practice, I'd warn you not to take too much chromium. Too much chromium will poison you. Not enough chromium will kill you. You have to have just the right amount of chromium. Now, there turns out there are 22 elements that we call vital metals, or vital poisons. Too much will kill you, too little will also kill you. Zinc is one of them, copper, iron, there's a whole suite of these vital poisons. When planet Earth was formed, these vital poisons were evenly distributed in the environment, basically in soluble form. But the Creator created first sulfate-reducing bacteria, and each species of sulfate-reducing bacteria focuses on a particular vital poison. There's ones that just eat zinc, and what they do is they absorb soluble zinc from the water and convert it into insoluble concentrated zinc deposits when they die. By that means, planet Earth, which had 1 part per million zinc in it 3.8 billion years ago, was transformed to 1 part per billion in soluble form, which is the ideal amount you want for advanced life. What happened to the rest of the zinc? Well, they were formed zinc sulfides when these bacteria died, and those are the mines that we go to get the metals that we need to sustain our high technology. Without 3 billion years of previously existing sulfate-reducing bacteria, we wouldn't have the iron, we wouldn't have the titanium, we wouldn't have the copper, the nickel to mine to sustain our advanced civilization. It'd be so evenly distributed, we would have never gotten out of the Stone Age. Moreover, we wouldn't have had the metals reduced to the right level so that advanced life could be survivable. Let me just rush off and talk to you about what's called the anthropic principle inequality. Namely, that astronomers, in looking at the universe, recognize that there are 51 different characteristics of the universe that must be exquisitely fine-tuned to make life possible. One of those characteristics is that the universe must have a very particular mass density. You heard earlier this morning, we live in a universe of 100 billion trillion stars, and it all seems like such a waste for one planet, but astronomers now recognize that if we didn't have those 100 billion trillion stars, you wouldn't even get one planet. The mass density of the universe must be tuned to within 1 part in 10 to the 60th, to 1 part in a trillion, 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 or there'd be no possibility for a planet like Earth ever existing. It's not all a waste, it's all there to make one planet suitable for the existence of life. And these same astronomers have recognized how amazing it is that our planet Earth can be prepared for intelligent life in only 14 billion years. Our calculations tell us it should take much longer. But with 4 outstanding miraculous interventions, the Type 1 and the Type 2 supernova, the white dwarf binary, this just right collision at the just right time, miracles of that nature enable our planet Earth to be prepared for human beings in only 14 billion years. But the window of time in which human civilization can exist by those same observations tell us the maximum window is 41,000 years. This is is what led Brandon Carter, the British cosmologist, to conclude there must be an extremely high purpose and value for the human species, given that our longevity is so short, and yet it takes so many billions of years to prepare a home for us. Now, to kind of give you a clue as to what we're in for, the end really is quite near, and this would apply to all intelligent life that could possibly exist in the universe. The universe is expanding more and more rapidly, and that means the star formation will inevitably shut down. That means the stars will burn out and all life will die in the universe. That's not going to happen for a couple of billion years. But the sun is eventually going to get so bright that trying to compensate for it would mean reducing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere down to a level that all the plants would now die. Plants need a minimum level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. You say, Hugh, how soon are we to facing that catastrophe? Well, if you're talking of bacterium, you might be able to survive another 30 million years. But if you're talking an advanced species like ours, the time window may be only 1 million years off. I've already talked about the unstable sun. It's going to become too unstable in just 50,000 years. The moon is exerting a torque on the Earth, which is causing our rotation rate to slow down, and it'll eventually be too slow to give us a small enough temperature difference between day and night. Hey, if an asteroid collides with the Earth, that's going to really mess up your investment portfolio. But much more probable is the fact that we're going to bump into an interstellar molecular cloud, and this will significantly drop the temperature of the Earth. If Sirius goes supernova, we are all in serious trouble. The termites will survive, the cockroaches will survive, but all mammals and birds would go extinct. And in the case of an advanced species, one of the problems is the greater the technology of a species, the greater the affluence of a species, the higher the mutation rate. And for the human species, towards the end of the 20th century, that was measured to be 3 negative mutations per person per generation, a prescription for rapid extinction of the human species. And of course, that would also apply to any other possibly existing extraterrestrial life species. In other words, the window of time for technology and civilization really only measures thousands of years wide. Now, let me just conclude here by telling you the very latest research we have on extrasolar planets. I visited the extrasolar planet website just as I was getting on the plane, and as of a couple of days ago, we now have detected 104 planetary systems outside the solar system, a total of 122 planets, and 14 of them are multiple planet systems. Now, as you heard me say earlier, all of these systems, the possibility that anyone would have a life support planet. We can't see planets small enough to be life support planets, but we do know that the big planets, the Jupiter-sized planets existing in these systems, all have characteristics that would give them a 0 probability for harboring a life support planet. We also have been able to exhaustively search the stars within 60 light years of Earth and recognize that none of them could retain the kind of massive planets that would be necessary for the support of life. So at least the immediate 60 light years we know is empty of a life supportable planet. Now, I'm not in favor of the search for extraterrestrial intelligent life, but they've been doing a lot of research thanks to your tax dollars and donations, and they've been able to establish that there are no planets within 155 light years of planet Earth where the civilization is at least advanced as we were in 1945. So in terms of an advanced civilization existing, out to 155 light years is empty. Now in terms of a super intelligent species, we know it's empty out to 1,000 light years, and with your tax dollars, they hope to extend this a little bit further. But some of the implications of this means that we could not have ever been visited by extraterrestrial intelligent life. Why? Because the minimum travel distance, there's no way you can go in a straight line. There's dangers as you travel through galactic space. You're going to have to avoid the dangers, which means your minimum travel distance will be 250 light years. You cannot travel at the velocity of light. By the way, if you read my book on extraterrestrials and UFOs, lights in the sky and little green men, it will guaranteed spoil your enjoyment of Star Trek. One of the problems I have with watching Star Trek, they just violate the laws of physics without any concern whatsoever. And what you recognize is that the maximum speed, regardless of technology or money, is not the velocity of light. It's about 1% the velocity of light. The faster you go through interstellar space, the more damage your ship is going to take. So any kind of craft made of plastics or metals or whatever exotic material you can imagine will suffer damage. The faster it goes, the damage goes up with the square of the velocity. Which means that the minimum travel time to get from some other system to our system is at least 25,000 years. Now this poses a problem because the window of time for the longevity of an intelligent species under ideal conditions is briefer than 25,000 years. So that species would go extinct before it had a chance to make the trip from their star system to our star system. And in terms of some of these structures we're seeing on Mars, the geology of those structures tells us that they're fairly old enough that we realize there's not been enough time in cosmic history to produce an intelligent species. In that context, we really could conclude that we are the first upon the scene because we are right at the base of the minimum time necessary, even in the context of miraculous intervention for us to get here, given the physics of the universe. Now, I know we're going to have a Q&A time later on, but I just wanted to advertise for you that the organization that I founded, we maintain a daily telephone hotline where you can call in and get your friends to call in every day except Christmas. That's available. And if you'd like to interact with us on some of the very latest scientific discoveries that have an impact on science and faith, every week we do a broadcast where we just focus on the past week's scientific discoveries. It's live, it's interactive. Feel free to call in or send us an email. And if you'd like this wonderful little magazine called Connections, where we keep you up to date on at least a few of these latest discoveries in layman's language, you can visit our website and or call our 800 number. And I want to thank you.
He says he's also not an alien.
Yeah, they had to throw that implant thing in there. I'm kind of in the position to, being at the end, to sort of say something evaluative, and I would like to do that, but I'd like to distinguish between what I'm not going to talk about for the hour and what I am going to talk about. Now, at the position that we are at in the program, I mean, we've heard Richard, and Richard has laid out his case for artificiality. Of course, he's very committed to the extraterrestrial hypothesis. And we've heard Dave, as I see it, Dave trying to get across the message that the ancients, for whatever reason, thought in certain ways. And there are motifs, there's vocabulary, there's motifs, there's architecture, there are full writings in the ancient world that have shared commonalities, including the Old Testament. And it appears in some way that there is some sort of correspondence between Mars in mythology that runs through these mythologies and the Old Testament, and of course then as we moderns pick it up, using that and asking some of these extraterrestrial questions and as it relates to Mars. Now, it makes you want to ask, okay, you know, who's right? If Richard is right, if these are artificial structures as it relates to the bigger picture here in my own topic, if he's right, we'll bring in Paul here as well, that infers intelligence, if these are artificial structures. Now, that doesn't mean it's extraterrestrial, it means that there's intelligence. It also means that Dave's paradigm becomes more important, because that introduces the whole idea, okay, why were the ancients able to deduce certain things and put certain things into their belief system that we sort of stumble over now? I mean, it has to mean something. There's so much of this, both in terms of frequency and quantity. There's so much of this patterning that it has to mean something. Now, if Richard's wrong, and these are not artificial, they're natural, Dave still has to come up with an explanation for why the patterning is there. Now, Richard, of course, says it's ET. Dave would say, and I checked with Dave just to make sure that I'm reading him correctly, Dave would say it's ET, okay, in quotation marks, meaning that this is a higher intelligence, but it's not alien like we would think of. Dave would prefer a supernatural explanation. God and the gods or angels, however we want to parse that, this is the explanation, that knowledge was handed down, much as it says in the Old Testament and in the book of Enoch, that there's a certain body of knowledge handed down, not from beings from another planet. By the way, I define extraterrestrial as a being that has a determinate lifespan, has to eat, has to intake water, has to have air. I mean, again, this is all carbon-based. But has to do the things we do, reproduces, goes to work, hates his job, has kids. But I mean, they have definite lifespans. They live and die. Okay, that is not the way that angels are described in the literature. Okay, so there is a dichotomy there. So on the one hand, one side says it's extraterrestrial with that meaning. I mean, these are naturalistic or natural life forms, biological life forms. And what Dave is saying is, well, we don't need that to have an answer, because the ancients, all the way from BC through the Common Era, the rabbis, all the way back to the Canaanites, going the other direction, the Egyptians, they all share these motifs because they share a common belief, a common memory of the distant past, the primeval past. And what happened in Dave's view is that supernatural being, God as it were, or his angels, fallen or unfallen, created the universe this way, that the mathematical designs of it are built in and show us intelligence, and that something went wrong, and now we have a competition on earth, as in heaven, so on earth. The spiritual forces in the heavens battling it out with the forces on earth, the people of God being confronted by evil in whatever form, but there is a cosmic battle and there's an earthly battle that somehow in the mythology and in the religion uses these common motifs, and Cydonia has something to do with that. Now, Dave he didn't mention this in his presentation, but he is drawing from an old tradition. He mentioned one phrase in Ezekiel, the stones of fire. He's taking that to be planets. That is possible. That is exegetically possible. That is a motif. Those are phrases that do get those meanings in ancient texts. Doesn't mean that they always get those meanings, but they do get them. And so Dave is drawing on a tradition that's very old, all the way up through the rabbinical period, the period of the early church, that believed that the planets were inhabited not by extraterrestrials, again, living, dying, having kids, hating their jobs, but they were inhabited by spiritual beings that could or could not take physical form and interact with Earth. Okay, Dave's not inventing that. He's not necessarily even recovering it, although I'd be willing to say that of his work. It does need to be recovered in a lot of ways, but the rabbis and the early church fathers, this is where they were at. They were part of their worldview, which is part of the Pythagorean system. So those are the two views. And then we get to Dr. Ross, who says there's basically no chance that there's an extraterrestrial life form. Again, on the one hand, that would be, I think it would be trouble with a small t for Richard, because Richard would just go and look somewhere else for other evidence. Again, operating from that paradigm. I don't think it's trouble for Dave. I think it's small t trouble for Dave, because Dave could say, hey, yeah, I don't believe there are physical aliens out there. I don't need it. I don't need them anywhere in the universe. What I do need are spiritual life forms, which Dr. Ross, of course, would assent to, the spiritual world, the world that God and other divine beings, angels, inhabit. And then with Dr. Nelson made an interesting statement, and I want to plant this seed for the panel discussion, because, hey, I get to do that. And that is, when he talked about Cydonia, he had on the nice PowerPoint presentation. Again, I'm a techno idiot, so I wouldn't even dare bring PowerPoint into the picture. But he had intelligent versus supernatural, these vocabulary words. Which one, should we incorporate, should we have into science, and which one would apply to Cydonia? And he said, well, if there is something there, he would use the word intelligent. What I'd like to know is, would you not use the word supernatural? okay, because that is where Dave is at, the supernatural explanation for something being on Cydonia, if indeed there is something there. So with that seed planted, we come down to me. Now all of that is set up for the panel. It's set up for question and answer. And so we're just going to move that to the side, and we're just going to presume, for the sake of this discussion, hey, what if it's all real? Okay, what if there are extraterrestrials out there? Whether we've been visited or not, let's just say that, hey, somebody finds something that meets the criteria for evidence that Dr. Nelson went over, goes through the filters correctly, there are no mistakes made, there's no logical errors, it's real data. Can the Judeo-Christian worldview sustain that? Can it accommodate that? That's what I want to focus on. Let me go back to the negative side, though. Again, what I'm not going to say or cover are things like, UFOs and abductions. We're going to push that to the side. We're talking about hard sciences here, again, without the question drifting off into whether the UFO thing delves with that or overlaps with it in any way. We're just going to think, academically for the time being. And that's not to imply that people who are interested in UFOs are non-academic, but you follow what I mean. We're not going to really focus on either the what I will call, for lack of a better term, mainline denominations or liberal denominations as they refer to Judaism or Christianity. Most of what you will read on this subject, the interface of Judeo-Christian religion with the question of extraterrestrial life, most of what you'll read in real academic journals that are written by religious types, either priests or religious scholars, theologians, most of that comes from a theological perspective where they don't need, from their perspective, they don't need to take the Bible at face value. They don't have a view of inspiration that would sort of say, well, every word is inspired and it's authoritative, it's infallible. They're not terribly careful or don't really have to be too meticulous on things like, how do we define who Jesus was, God, man, something else in between, or how do we define our terms? I mean, there's lots of fudge room. The people I want to target with are the ones that you ought to, I think, really think of when this subject comes up. And if you listen to when Richard and I were on the show, Coast to Coast AM, a few weeks ago, Art Bell kept going, and he was very honest. He said, look, I'm going to play the fundamentalist. I'm going to play the fundamentalist believer and just go after you guys. And that's the audience that I want to target, because the subject is largely unaddressed, and it's a very fearful one when it comes to those groups. And there are reasons for why the idea of an extraterrestrial reality scares those groups theologically. So that's what I want to hit on. It's in one sense it's a purely hypothetical. Again, I'm not staking a claim as to whether I think they're ETs or not. I mean, right now I guess I'd have to be agnostic, but I'm open. I mean, it's not going to bother me, and that will be evident as I go through this. On one sense, it would be really neat. In the other sense, I really don't care. I mean, so there's something in between there. I don't care in the sense that it's not going to make me give up anything in my faith. And on the other hand, it would be really neat just because it would be so different, it would be so dramatic, it would be so climactic. So just so you know a little bit about where I am, where I'm going, my goal today, again, is to target really, really conservative Christians and really, really conservative Jews. Muslims don't have so much of a problem with the question because the Quran has certain passages in it that talk about other worlds, and so they don't really get thrown into the mix too much. So we're going to concentrate on the other two areas. And so I have a twofold target, twofold goal. One is to demonstrate to those people in that group. So pretend that you're in that group. We're going to be talking theology here. For some of you it will be very familiar. For some of you it won't be familiar at all. But we'll try to make it translatable even to those in the latter group. But I want to demonstrate that compatibility is possible. Even if you take a very strict view of the Bible, what I'm going to suggest is that if there were an extraterrestrial reality, you don't have to give up your view of the inspiration of the Bible. You don't have to feel like you're fudging on any point of doctrine. You don't have to resort to a system of interpretation that just allegorizes everything to death and the text doesn't mean what it says. You don't have to give up any of that. And I think that people in those groups, that's where they're at. There's just a panic that it's either my faith or it's this. And what I'm saying is, no, that is not the question. That's not the dichotomy. So my second goal is to demonstrate that the question in and of itself is important because people need to intelligently defend their faith. I ran across an article by Ernan McMullen, who's an internationally respected philosopher of science, who used to teach at Notre Dame, and he said, a religion which is unable to find a place for ET, or extraterrestrial persons, in its view of God and the universe, might find it difficult to command terrestrial assent in the days to come. That is, if this ever happens, if this ever is shown to be real, and the church, again, the conservative church, has put all its eggs in one basket, and the basket gets run over by a cosmic truck, okay, it's going to be in trouble if it hasn't thought through the issue. And the answer is not to dump your faith or just dilute it into nothing, where it's just meaningless. It's just, it's pablum. Okay, that is not what I'm going to propose to you today. So, getting started here, a little historical perspective. It didn't used to be this way. It might shock you that in bygone centuries, some of the leading enthusiasts for extraterrestrial life out there somewhere in the universe were Christians and were Christian theologians. Okay, that is not the case today for a variety of factors. Just a quick survey. This goes all the way back to Aristotle, and I'm going to reference Michael Crow, who was a professor in the history and philosophy of science at Notre Dame as well. He has a book called The Extraterrestrial Life Debate, which is, again, a historical philosophical survey of this, so I'm borrowing some of his observations and his work there. It goes all the way back to Plato and Aristotle, who were opposed to the idea of extraterrestrials, and since many Christian theologians followed their work, followed their systems, merging philosophy and theology, many of the early Christian theologians were opposed, but around 1277, a remarkable development occurred. In that year, Etienne Tempier, the Bishop of Paris, issued a condemnation of doctrines that seemed to set limits to God's omnipotence. So this guy comes up, the bishop comes up with a list. Hey, these are the doctrines, these are teachings we don't like, that the church is forbidding because they limit God's omnipotence, his all-powerful ability. One of the propositions condemned was, quote, that the first cause, God, cannot make many worlds. So the church officially came out condemning the idea that there weren't other worlds. This was the official proclamation. This is 1277. This is back when they still believed the Bible's inspired. Okay, this isn't the late 19th century, the early 20th century, where we get critical methodology, higher criticism, liberal theology. I mean, they took it, they believed everything, hook, line, sinker, every jot and tittle. They weren't about to fudge on what the text said, and they didn't have any problem with it. In fact, they said, if you don't believe this, you are limiting God, and that's not a good thing to do. This openness led to the introduction of what Christian philosophers would call the principle of plenitude during the Renaissance. This was a philosophical, theological idea. It's not a biblical one in that you're not going to find a verse that talks about the multiplication of other worlds, and we'll get to the biblical absence of that. But it was a theological or philosophical one. Hey, God can do lots of things. He's omnipotent. He could do this. The principle of plenitude posited that an omnipotent creator, like that proposed in the Bible, must of necessity bring to all that is possible to fully honor his own goodness and power. And since it's possible that he could have made other worlds, if he didn't, that position would have God not doing all he could to glorify himself. So it stands to reason that, hey, there's lots of worlds out there. This was the official position of the church. During the Reformation, though, the principle of plenitude faced some opposition, particularly from the Lutheran reformer Philip Melanchthon. If you're Lutheran, you would know that name, who in 1550 warned that Copernican cosmology would lead to the idea that Christ's incarnation and redemption could have occurred on another planet. A few decades later, René Descartes disputed Melanchthon's contention that the idea of ETs was a threat to these doctrines, when he said, this is Descartes, I do not see at all that the mystery of the incarnation and all the other advantages that God has brought forth for man obstruct him from having brought forth an infinity of other great very advantages for an infinity of other creatures. And although I do not at all infer from this that there would be intelligent creatures in the stars or elsewhere, I also do not see that there would be any reason by which to prove that there were not. Okay, this is Descartes, he's a loyal Catholic. So even during the Reformation period, when some Christians are saying, boy, if we say this, then, this idea of Jesus having to be crucified again for the ET on some other planet. Now that, I'm just going to tip my hand to where I'm going. That is one of what I see as 4 or 5 pseudo problems in theology. I think that is a flawed question. I think it's it's packed with flawed assumptions. But when you read the literature, when religion interfaces with the extraterrestrial question, this always comes up. Well, Christ died for the sins of the world, and if ET is intelligent, if ET could have some kind of religious feeling or religious affinity, or ET would want to commune with God, is he automatically cut off and he gets sent to hell? I mean, it just doesn't sound right. And so this whole question of Christ having to kind of do it over again for any race out there in the cosmos became an issue for theologians in this area. Belief in extraterrestrials among Christians and Christian theologians continued to be quite prominent during the Enlightenment. Near the end of the 18th century, the consensus, this is the consensus within the church, was that the universe was teeming with life. Many Christians believed the possibility actually enhanced one's religious perspective in light of the principle of plenitude. It showed God was really omnipotent, even more than we thought. The acceptance of extraterrestrial life among Christians was soon undermined, however, by one of the Enlightenment's major thinkers. In 1793, Thomas Paine argued in his book, The Age of Reason, that astronomical science had made it impossible for any thinking person to accept the central Christian notions of a divine incarnation and a redeemer. In confronting Christianity with the ET claim, Paine became a deist, that is, a person accepting a remote, impersonal God, but denying such central Christian doctrines as Christ's incarnation, that Christ was God in the flesh, and redemption, that when Christ died on the cross, it was the atoning sacrifice for the sins of the whole world. Okay, the deists didn't believe that. They believed in a God, but they didn't believe that. Now, in Paine's own words, and we're all familiar with Thomas Paine, from whence could arise the strange conceit that the Almighty should come to die in our world because, they say, one man and one woman had eaten an apple? And on the other hand, are we to suppose that every world in the boundless creation had an Eve, an apple, a serpent, and a redeemer? In this case, the person who is irreverently called the Son of God, and sometimes God himself, would have nothing else to do than to travel from world to world in an endless succession of death with scarcely a momentary interval of life. He'd be dying all the time. And so Paine is saying, this idea that there's all these worlds out there, you just cannot hold to Christian theology and believe this. He was the first one to really go after what was then the consensus view. Again, now, look at what he's assuming. He's assuming there has to be a fall. He's assuming that a fall, if there was such a thing, it would be the same as on earth. He's assuming that there has to be redemption. He's assuming that there has to be incarnation. When we get to this point in a few minutes, I'm going to show that all these assumptions are flawed. Okay? But this was really a gauntlet that was laid down. In essence, what Paine was saying, look, you either have to reject the belief in extraterrestrial life or you have to reject your Christianity, period. And his opinion held sway for a long time. Now, there were people who reacted to him. Timothy Dwight, who was the president of Yale University, a very famous evangelical preacher. Thomas Chalmers, overseas, the same way, very evangelical, a very famous preacher. They objected to Paine's views, and they would debate with him in print and in sermons and things like that. But the tide was sort of turned, that this became a serious thing theologically, that you would have to dump your faith. Support for the idea of extraterrestrial life continued through the late 19th and early 20th centuries in the church, but it soon became a threat that many Christians see it to be today. With the advent of Darwinism, Christians and Jews who took the Bible's claim of a divine creator seriously began to view scientists as antagonistic to the faith, and many were. There were a lot of scientists who were very dedicated, devout Christians who accepted Darwinism. There are a lot of those today. In my own church, in Madison, Wisconsin, we have the head of the botany department, we have the head of environmental studies, we have 2 research physicists, we have at least 1 PhD student in geology, we've had 2 or 3 entomologists, PhDs go through our ranks, we've got just a pile of grad students. For some reason, they're heavily stilted toward the sciences. I mean, this is common. If you think that Christianity is monolithic in its perspective on origins, extraterrestrial life, all sorts of things, you need to get your head out of the sand, and you need to stop caricaturing the other side. Okay, Paine was very antagonistic, and we shouldn't be that. I mean, we need to investigate the other side. And so this whole thing about injecting Darwinism into it shouldn't necessarily deter a Christian from entertaining the question of extraterrestrial life. That's going to be another problem I'll hit in a few minutes, that somehow it's gotten in our minds that if ET is out there, it proves evolution. Why? Why? But that is out there. Okay? So that Darwin came in, and so a combination of Paine and Darwin just started to essentially pummel the church in this area and drive people out. Now, a few observations. Historically speaking, number one, the church has in many instances been quite supportive of the idea of extraterrestrial life. So to say otherwise, that this has always been the bane of the church, is just wrong. 2, the idea of extraterrestrial life did raise important theological questions within the church, like the incarnation and redemption, but these questions were not viewed by many theologians as having any significant impact at all. There were some that felt threatened and lots that didn't. In this regard, it's significant, again, that we're dealing with theologians in an era, again, in the era when it was most supported, that is previous to methods used by liberal Jews and liberal Christians today to interpret the Bible. These guys like Timothy Dwight, Chalmers, way back into the church fathers, these were people who believed that the Bible was inspired, that it came from God. It was revelation from God, it was authoritative, and it was infallible, and they had no problem with this. Okay, that we need to keep in mind. Now, 2 things drove the church away and continues to drive the church away, and I've alluded to both, so I'll summarize them here. 1 is the manufacture of pseudo-theological problems from Christianity's enemies, people like Paine, who were deists. In other words, why does Paine get to create the theological problem and then impose the problem on the church and define the terms for the church and then say, you church, you can't cope with this? Why is that? Well, we'll get to that, but he did. The second thing is the logically unnecessary linkage of naturalistic random evolution to the idea of extraterrestrial life. Now, the former, the theological problems, made Christians wonder if extraterrestrial life was a problem. The latter forced Christians to distance themselves from the idea by default because they didn't want to be evolutionists. So these are the things that, in an umbrella sense, that are plaguing the issue, that are affecting the issue. Had Enlightenment deists like Paine not used the issue to attack Christianity, things might be different today. Had evolutionists, people who would be non-theistic in their naturalism, not linked the idea of extraterrestrial life to their system of science, to their methodology, things might be different today. Had ministers and theologians not ignored the issue, and had they been astute enough to confront bad theology when they saw it and teach their people, things might be different today. But here we are today. Here are what I see as 4 fear generators within, or to people who are very conservative theological in Judaism and Christianity. Here are the 4 things that 4 humps that they have to get over. Number 1, they're afraid that the notion of intelligent alien life undoes the doctrine of the inerrancy of the Bible. Okay, some people are in this camp that, hey, if the Bible doesn't say it, it's not true. I can't find any verses in the Bible that talk about extraterrestrials or other planets, therefore, it's not true. I'm not going to try to be too kind here. That is really naive. I mean, what else isn't in the Bible? I mean, look around the room. Radio, microphones, toilet paper, what has to be in the Bible? Microwaves. Where do we come up with this? How about the other planets? I mean, for crying out loud, where's Saturn? It is just unworkable. It's a silly argument that if you are in this camp, again, conservative Jew or Christian, you don't live this way anyway. I mean, you interact and use things all the time that are not in the Bible. So what is the big deal? Nevertheless, people are there, and what I'm suggesting is get over it. Okay, broaden your worldview, look around you, either that or eliminate everything in your life that is not in the Bible. And that's probably where we get hermits, and pole sitters and things like that. I mean, it's just not going to work. Number 2, second problem, second fear generator, is the notion of intelligent alien life, quote-unquote, proves, or at least supports, the theories of naturalistic evolution and panspermia. Panspermia, Dr. Ross, again, touching on this today, that life was seeded from space either in an undirected way, an accidental way, a random way, or directed panspermia, that E.T., planted life on Earth, okay, deliberately. There's intent and there's intelligence there. Now, to some extent, this objection is as irrelevant as the first, since there were many theologically conservative Jews and Christians, especially those with advanced graduate degrees in science, who embraced the theory of evolution. Okay, there's lots of those. I mean, I have plenty in my church. I could bring them up here and stick them with pins. They're real. They're out there. Now, for theistic evolutionists, for people who would embrace the idea of evolution and still be very devout Christians, for them the concern is not evolution, but the naturalistic, purposeless, random articulation of evolution. One of the fundamental things, the fundamental non-negotiables for a conservative Jew or Christian, whether they accept evolution or not, is that God created all things. And if he created the process of evolution, and that's how things get explained, fine. Then I just look at it and say, oh, that's how God did it. That's interesting. Okay? That's all that needs to be said. And there are verses that could be taken this way. For instance, in Genesis 1:20, this is kind of interesting. I'm not staking a position on it. It doesn't really matter to me. It says that the earth brought forth a whole list of life forms. Okay, Augustine noticed that. Early church fathers noticed. I mean, it's not like they were evolutionists. They didn't know what evolution was. But they noticed that, hey, right here in this verse, it doesn't have God doing it or reproducing after their kind. The earth brings forth these critters. And that isn't really the way it normally happens. Wonder what that means. And so some Christians have noticed that, and it has become a foundational point of articulation for evolutionary theory along with creation, along with a creator. If you also accept evolution as a Christian, if alien life forms, intelligent or not, were discovered, those in this category would assume that God started the evolutionary processes somewhere else. The process works on Earth, it works somewhere else, and it produces something that's a little different from us. Ooh, wow, that really scares me. I accept it here, why not accept it there? Now, the real rub, though, comes with people who don't accept evolution. Those who reject it would, by default, now catch this, by default, they would be forced to argue that God created alien life forms just like he created life on Earth, essentially out of nothing. There it is. As noted above, there's abundant evidence that this was the position of many Christian theologians prior to Darwinism. Did you catch that? Prior to Darwin, nobody heard of evolution. The idea of a creator God did not have competition. And at the same time that people affirmed a creator God, a very literalistic view, literalistic interpretation of the Old Testament, at the same time, they said, if you don't believe there are other worlds, you're in theological trouble because you're limiting God's omnipotence. They did not have a problem. And what I'm suggesting is if you reject evolution, you don't have a problem today either. If they didn't have a problem then, you don't have one now. The only reason you think you have a problem is because science has planted in your mind this connection that is not necessary. It has put it in your mind that if ET's out there, evolution is the truth. And I don't want to believe in evolution, so I can't believe in ET. Why? I mean, do a little historical research, read some of these older theologians, and you'll find out they had no problem with it. Now, I think we should unpack this a little bit more. A few thoughts. We must realize that the validity of evolution in no way explains the origin of matter present at the beginning of an evolutionary process. How organic matter evolves and how it got there are separate questions. In like manner, an advanced intelligent ET would not answer the question of origins either due to the philosophically untenable notion that a created thing brought the creation into existence, or for other reasons, okay, that we'll get to in a moment. Did you catch that again? Just because there's ET's here, that doesn't explain how ET got here. The fact that he's here and he evolved doesn't explain who started the process. Doesn't explain it at all. We're still left with that conundrum. Another thought, regarding panspermia, the presence of life all over the universe would not prove evolution any more than the presence of life all over the globe. Conservative Jews and Christians could simply posit that God created these other life forms, which is in concert with what they've done for hundreds of years, prior to Darwinism. Insisting that the presence of life elsewhere overturns the belief in a creator God is a deliberate choice stemming from your worldview and nothing more. Third, regarding panspermia once again, if God indeed created life all over the universe, it is reasonable to expect a genetic relationship between that life and Earth life on the basis of genetic relationships between life forms here. Why would you expect it to be anything different? This is life as we know it here, especially if evolution is true. There is commonality. Okay, all we're saying is, look, if there's commonality here, why would commonality somewhere else undo the idea of creation? I mean, why does that prove anything? It doesn't. Genetic relationships between life forms do not argue for a cause and effect relationship. Even if intelligent life forms from elsewhere were quite similar to us genetically, or even visually or whatever, it's not sufficient on this point to assume a cause-effect relationship because we are presuming they are technologically superior to us either. We are technologically superior to apes, but we're not their creators. One cannot then retreat and say, well, we're the product of evolution, so that isn't a fair comparison. Well, it is a fair comparison if you believe that ET is here by evolution. I mean, it's just logically inconsistent. What if ET claimed, though, to have made us? The question then becomes how he would prove it. How do we know he's not lying? I mean, one lands on the White House lawn or here on the stage, hey, I made you. Well, that's nice. Prove it. What's he going to do? Show us a video?
It is I. The journey you undertook to reach me could not have been an easy one.
It was not. The barrier stood between us, but we breached it.
Magnificent. You are the first to find me.
We sought only your infinite wisdom.
And how did you breach the barrier?
With a starship.
This starship, could it carry my wisdom beyond the barrier?
It could, yes.
Then I shall make use of this starship.
It will be your chariot.
Excuse me.
It will carry my power to every corner of creation.
Excuse me, I'd just like to ask a question. What does God need with a starship?
Bring the ship closer.
I said, what does God need with a starship? Jim, what are you doing? I'm asking you a question.
Who is this creature?
Who am I? Don't you know? Aren't you God?
He has his doubts.
You doubt me?
I seek proof. Jim, you don't ask the Almighty for his ID.
Then here is the proof you seek.
Now catch this. Any of the means that we would think would be persuasive to human beings, something visual, a past record or something like that. I hate to be this flippant, but if we could fake it, do you think he's smart enough to? If we have agendas, do you think they might? I mean, if you know, Richard and others want to talk about the image of God, and we'll get there in a moment, the image of God, if it is shared, implies a whole lot of things, okay? You cannot divorce intent, motive, conscience, or seared conscience, intuition, again, any of the thought processes that go on in our minds, good or evil. Why would we assume that it's all of a sudden not in them? Again, it's an assumption that is unwarranted and frankly unprovable. You know, and I'd love to, I guess I will. You know, if E.T. were to pop here on the stage and say, hey, Mike, you know, we put you here, I would say, well, you know, a great philosopher and scientist once said, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And I would just love to throw Sagan's quote right back at an E.T. I mean, that would just make my day. So I do know what I would say if I ran into one, and if he claimed that. Now, at this point, you might be wondering, okay, if God created other life forms in the universe, would he love them? I mean, this really gets a little more serious. This is where the early church, you know, struggled a bit. Would they be fallen? Could they do evil? If so, would God redeem them? Would he take them to heaven? Would he offer them a way of salvation? In Christian language, would Christ's death also be for their sin, or would he have to be incarnated and die an ad infinitum number of times, like Thomas Paine was ridiculing? And that brings up the third issue of concern. A lot of people are worried that the notion of intelligent alien life undoes the doctrines of the incarnation of Christ and redemption. This is the way C.S. Lewis, a famous Christian author, put this. He said, if the universe is teeming with life, again, he's just stating the position, this, we are told, reduces to absurdity the Christian claim that to this one planet God came down and was incarnate for us and our salvation. Paul Davies puts it this way, of all the world's major religions, Christianity is the most species-specific. Jesus Christ was humanity's Savior and Redeemer. He did not die for the dolphins or the gorillas, and certainly not for the proverbial little green men. But what of deeply spiritual aliens? Are they not to be saved? Are we to contemplate a universe that contains perhaps 1 trillion worlds of saintly beings in which the only beings eligible for salvation are the really bad ones on earth? I mean, this is how Davies, you know, framed the question. Catholics, again, and others, you know, see where this is going about this multiple incarnation thing, and that's what spooks them. Now, this alleged problem proceeds along a number of assumptions, all of which I believe are flawed. In Christian theology, all humans need to be redeemed, to have their moral guilt before a holy God erased and forgiven. The mechanism for this is the sacrificial death of Christ on behalf of all humanity and his resurrection. Salvation cannot be merited, but is imparted to all those who put their faith in what Jesus did. This is the gospel. As such, Davies' comments in particular show a fundamental misunderstanding of the gospel, for one thing. But be that as it may, the assumption that E.T. needs a Savior would have to be based on the prior assumption that E.T. was guilty before God. The guilt would in turn have to be incurred when and if E.T. failed a moral test, like the one put to Adam and Eve in an event called the fall. Now, some thoughts for you. The fact that E.T. is intelligent has nothing to do with his need of salvation. Adam and Eve were intelligent creatures, but did not need salvation until they sinned. E.T. would only need salvation if there was a fall for E.T. The Bible teaches that every human bears guilt before God. Since E.T. is not human, he is exempt without a fall. E.T. would not need a Savior, and so that makes the question moot. I would like to say it makes the question silly. But nevertheless, it was a serious question within the church. Why would we assume God would test the ETs he created? He might, but this is not required, and God would not be forced to do this because he did it on earth. And if he did not test ET and ET was unfallen, the whole problem is moot. The fact that ET was a created being in God's grand creative output also does not mean that salvation is necessary. Animals don't need to be saved, yet they are part of the new heaven and the new earth at the time of the end. Angels are also intelligent created beings, and they are not included in the plan of salvation according to the Bible. If there are aliens, they may also have been excluded from the plan of salvation. One would not need to conclude from this that they, like fallen angels, would be eternally punished. They might just die and that's it. Okay? Now, on the other hand, and this is where I want to go, because I'm amazed, I'm just frankly amazed that everybody I've seen write on this subject acts like Romans chapter 8 doesn't exist. Romans chapter 8 and Colossians chapter 1 answers this question. And it's like, could someone please quote the Bible if we're talking about it? ETs, on the other hand, would be included under the atonement of Christ, but not in a spiritual salvation sense. Here's how they would be included. They would be included with everything else in the created world, the created cosmos. Romans 8. Now listen to this as I read. Paul says, "For I reckon that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which will be revealed in us. For the earnest action itself also," catch this, "the creation itself also will be delivered from the bondage of the corruption of the fall into the glorious liberty of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation groans and travails in pain together until now." Paul says, because of what Christ did, the whole creation, every speck of the cosmos, will be made new. And you are only excluded from that if you retain moral guilt before God. If you essentially thumb your nose at God's plan for you to participate at that time. And if the angels, if ETs, whatever, if they have never become morally guilty before God, they're in. They've got the ticket. And it's by God's design. Just read your Colossians 1. Same idea. Again, I'm amazed that it's like nobody knows these passages are there. Colossians 1, Paul writing again, "For this cause we also, since the day we heard it, do not cease to pray for you, and so desire that you might be filled with the knowledge of his will in all wisdom and spiritual understanding, and that in all things he might have the preeminence. For it pleased the Father that in him should all fullness dwell, and having made peace through the blood of his cross, by him, to reconcile all things unto himself, by him, whether they be things in earth or things in heaven." But one of the reasons that God came up with the plan of the incarnation and redemption was so that the entire cosmos, which he, through Christ, created, could be saved and redeemed. The only way you are not in that group is if you retain deliberately by your own choice your moral guilt before God. If you've never had moral guilt before God, if you've never fallen, and again, if ET's out there and there's no fall out there on another planet, he's in. This is a totally moot, irrelevant question. And I don't know why it has plagued the church for so long. Lastly, the fourth major, again, fear creator is that, okay, the church has put an awful lot of stock in human beings having a special relationship to God. And that is usually referred to by this phrase we get in Genesis, the image of God. That humankind, male and female, are created in God's image. We get this phrase. Now, the reasoning goes like this. The assumption is that the image of God refers to our intelligence, our ability to commune with God. Perhaps some theologians have said our ability to speak a language, to communicate, because the image of God separates us from animals. There's been a whole array of I can give you a list of things that people have said, well, this is the image, this is what it means. One of them, as Richard implied today, and I can't remember who he quoted, said that the image is a physical likeness. Now that's the easiest one to rule out. And I wish I knew who Richard will tell me later who the quotation comes from. Because Jesus says very plainly in John chapter 4 that God is a spirit. He does not have a body. Okay, so the image, the likeness of God, does not refer to physical form. I mean, that would take you into all sorts of gender problems too. Okay? God does not have a body. I mean, no theistic system teaches that God has a body. Now, God appears in physical form in the Old Testament and the New. If you're a Christian, you would naturally say that's Christ. There's a lot of that going on in the Old Testament as well. He appears that way, and most of the time it's visual, but sometimes you can actually touch, and it's a physical form. But God does not have a body. He can use one if he likes, and sometimes he does. It's a lot easier than maybe speaking out of a cloud or a fire, even though God does that too. But he does not have a body. He is a spirit. It's very clear. So what is the image? What about the image of God? I would suggest to you, let me do it this way. Here's what you have to have in terms of the image of God. Let me read you the passage that Richard had up. Then God said, "Let us make humankind in our image, in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, over the livestock, so on and so forth." So God created humankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. This phrase is actually pretty rare. It's only like 3 or 4 times. There's another one in Genesis 5 where it says, "This is the account of Adam's line when God created humankind. He made him in the likeness of God. He created the male and female, so on and so forth. And Adam has a child, and the child is in God's image also." And then there's a reference to a capital punishment institution in Genesis 9. But that's it. So what does the image mean? Well, I would suggest you need certain things. Both men and women have to have it, male and female. The image is that which makes humankind distinct from the rest of Genesis, the rest of all creation. There's something about the image that makes us like God. There's nothing in the text to suggest that you get it in stages. I mean, you either have it or you don't. And this is an important issue for ethics. You know, the whole abortion debate, the beginning of life, end of life, when are you a person? When do you cease to be a person? What about the field of animal cognition? It's a whole field in psychology, that animals do have intelligence. And oh, by the way, they do have communication ability. You've assumed that they don't have communication if they can't communicate from them to you. Why not across species? You're telling me that a termite colony, there's no intelligence? I mean, how do you define intelligence? If you have an animal that remembers how to do one thing that it doesn't pop out of its mother's womb knowing how to do, if you have taught it to do something and it remembers that, that has to be intelligence. And you read in this field, you get all these tests, and frankly, some of them are really funny, where they'll set up intelligence tests. You know, they got the chicken, you know, they've got some bug, they've got a puppy and a kitten, and then a toddler. And like the toddlers always end up failing all the tests, you know. And, you know, it's simple repetition and memory. Now, you know, you can either dismiss the toddler as an intelligent life form, or you define intelligence in a way that incorporates these things in the animal world. What about artificial intelligence?
You don't mind talking about it, do you, Dave?
What about extraterrestrial intelligence? What about angelic intelligence? They're not human either. I mean, it just doesn't work. And so what I'd like to suggest is actually a point of Hebrew grammar, and I'm not going to have a linguistic spasm here. But as a point of Hebrew grammar, think of it this way. I'm going to tell you how the verse should be translated, but I'm going to illustrate it in English. Think of the phrase, "in the image of God." Now, I don't want to sound like President Clinton, but the word "in," the word "in" does have variation in meaning. You know, he used the word "is," and we won't touch that. Okay, "in." If I say, "Put the dishes in the sink," what do I mean? I'm talking about location. "In" denotes location. If I say, "The pot broke in pieces," I'm not talking about location there. I'm talking about the result. Some force acted upon the pot. The result was that it became in pieces. If I say, "I worked in banking," sometimes my wife wishes I did. I had to say that. "I worked in education. I worked in ministry. I worked in chemistry." What do I mean? It means I worked as a banker, as a teacher, as a chemist. I worked in the capacity of a banker, a chemist, a teacher. Take that back to Genesis. And again, in Hebrew grammar, this is called, here's my linguistic spasm, forgive me. This is called the bet essentia, or the bet of predication. The word in Hebrew is the little letter B, bet in Hebrew. It's attached to the noun tselem, image. And it should be translated, God created humankind as his image. The meaning is this. It has nothing to do with intelligence or this whole list. Every human being is God's representative on earth. You function as though God were here physically. This is what theologically gives your work meaning. You should work as a human being and do the best job you can at whatever you do, because you should do it understanding that God put you there and you're supposed to do your job like he would. And it's wonderful in the sciences because there's a great theological justification for going into science. What is it? Look, you should look at science like God does. You should learn to think about it like God does. Learn what makes it tick and learn it well. Understand the secrets of the physical universe. Wherever you're at, you are God's representative, every human being. And that is an intrinsic quality of humanness. It has nothing to do with theology or religion, what denomination you are. You are human, you are God's imager. You are his representative. Here's the point. E.T., if he exists, is not God's representative on earth. Only humans are. Now, if God wants to make E.T. his representative on some other planet, I'm going to agree with the principle of plenitude and say, well, God, I guess you can do that. We try not to put God and can't into too many sentences. Okay? That's all we're saying. The image of God does make humanity certifiably unique. The animals are not God's representatives. The plants are not. Only human beings are. And the command, if you look in the next two verses, God puts them on earth. Be my imager on earth. He doesn't say, be my imager on Saturn, okay, or on some planet that I'd tell you about, but you really wouldn't get it anyway. Okay, he says on earth. Okay, and that is the point. So it makes humankind certifiably unique among all creation, but it does not preclude in any way E.T. being intelligent. All those, the whole list, intelligence, emotion, ability to commune with God, these are secondary things that help us fulfill our mission, but they do not define what the image is. They're tools to act as imagers. They are not the image itself. The image is a status on this planet. No other planet on this one. So these four things, this ongoing perpetuation of science that somehow says if E.T.'s out there, it is deadly to a theistic worldview. You can just scrap the idea of a creator. If we find E.T., the creation idea, in whatever form it takes, is toast. Okay, that's one obstacle. Two is, again, the accumulation of bogus theological worries within Christian circles. Again, I think that the problems that have been created are artificial. Before I go, I would like to throw this out. One thing that I've also noticed reading through this material is how people who want desperately to believe in extraterrestrials, for them it has become a religious faith and a religious pursuit for many of them. Listen to Dr. Frank Drake, who's famous for the Drake equation. I thought this was really interesting. I mean, his interests clearly began, this is a quote from his autobiography, as a search for a religious substitute. He says, "I've been waiting for this moment nearly all my life. Indeed, if there is anything unusual about my otherwise normal childhood, it is that I started tracing my ties to alien civilizations of intelligent life in the universe at age 8. I did this in spite of my family's fundamentalist religious beliefs and despite their scorn for fantastic ideas." It's pretty blunt. He traded one religion for another. So I started the discussion, asking the question, well, if there's an extraterrestrial reality out there, can the Judeo-Christian world accommodate it? I'd like to end it by asking this question. If evidence of intelligent extraterrestrial life never surfaces, for sure, if the astronomical odds that life is out there are never beaten, if the problem of matter creating itself is never scientifically demonstrated and made philosophically coherent, if the evidence for intelligent design of life on Earth cannot be answered by appeal to E.T. designers, then will the scientific materialists who look for the blessed hope of E.T. be able to sustain their belief system? Thanks. the Hebrew alphabet is based upon something called the acrophonic principle. And all, isn't that an impressive word? All that that means is that there are words in the Hebrew language, where the person who Hebrew actually adopted, as Dave told us today, the Phoenician alphabet. And it actually goes further than that. It goes back to Egypt. But the word for house in the language began with the B sound. And so that became the letter B, bet, B-E-T-H in English. So bet is the name of the letter, but it is also the word for house. Yes.
But it's also a verb, is it not a causing, containing?
Well, I mean, the examples you give aren't necessarily verbs. Housing would still be a noun. Containing would be a verb. It's also a preposition. I can't think. I mean, this doesn't mean that that's not correct. I can't think of any references where the idea is a verbal, or used as a strict verb. But there might be in some other Semitic language. I can't think of any examples. It's a pretty common word. I guess I'll have to leave it there. I can't think of an example, but maybe there's one out there. Is there a reason why? Were you going somewhere with that? Or?
Well, some of the reading I've been doing indicated that there was this verseness in the language, or a process, as opposed to static containment.
Well, to be really honest with you, if you're a good rabbi or a good Kabbalist, you can pretty much make any any word say. I can't. When we're trained in linguistics, you adopt the word meanings, very strictly, the way they're used in context in the languages. But rabbis and exegetes, both in Christian and non-Christian, Jewish tradition, felt very free to depart from that. So I have no doubt that you would have read that somewhere. They just felt, they didn't feel restricted that they had to stay with what modern linguistically we would be doing. Anybody else? The question was, is the discussion of extraterrestrial stuff all about cults, or I would guess you would put the occult in there as well. It really depends what you're talking about. When we started thinking about this conference, we wanted this conference to address not ufology and not abductions and things like that. Those things are naturally related to the question of extraterrestrial life, but the areas are actually different. In other words, if you took ufology as an umbrella discipline, if any of you have read The Facade or seen my website, and I would be in concert with Dr. Ross here, that much of what passes for ufology is very occult-laden. Now, that doesn't mean all of it is, but much of it is. Much of it, I think other parts of it break down into different areas. But all of that is separate from the question of is there extraterrestrial life out there. This is a question that has been discussed in the church for centuries. And nobody's thinking about linking Aquinas, when Aquinas addresses the question of extraterrestrial life, he's not wondering and speculating if it's related to ghosts or paranormal visions or these new age kind of things that get lumped into the issue. And so what we wanted to do here was we wanted to say, hey, this isn't about ufology. It's about this age-old question that in the SETI program, for instance, has been approached scientifically. So we wanted to approach it academically. That's a long way of saying it really depends on what your friend is thinking you came to listen to. If you wound up going to something about abductions, there's a lot of similarity between abduction claims and satanic ritual abuse. That's just a fact. 1992 MIT conference on alien abductions. There's a very long paper on that, and it's not just one or two correlations, it's 30 or 40. Now, that doesn't mean that that's an explanation for every experience, every event. But these kind of things are very traceable in the literature, both in modern era and the medieval era that were often associated with the occult activity. In my mind, that doesn't have anything to do with the question we're talking about today. So I don't think she has a reason to be concerned. Yes, sir. Next. The idea that ufology is related to the occult is not a Christian dogma. Have you ever heard of Jacques Vallée? He is not a Christian. He's the French ufologist. He doesn't do ufology now. He lives in San Francisco. He has his PhDs in computer science. He runs a company out there. Vallée, if you read his books, and he's been involved in it since the days of Hynek. He is not a hack. He's a good researcher. He's a good scholar, but he believes that 90+% of the UFO field or phenomenon is either a misunderstanding of what people observe, or it is a direct occult thing. He is not a Christian. In fact, he has some real problems with the Catholic Church, and he's very vocal about that. John Keel, the Mothman prophecies. These people have no religious axe to grind, but they notice occult motifs in the literature they read within ufology and in the medieval era. During the occult renaissance in America, the spiritualist era, all the way back. And what they're doing is they're being honest. They're saying, look, a lot of this stuff, the similarities are just there. And again, I'm not saying that everybody who does UFO research is into the occult. I don't believe that. But on the other hand, I can't deny that there's just a lot of this stuff that is just hitting you in the face that's similar. And so I think Christians tend to see that, plus the media, the TV, how it gets associated with really scary things, and they make that jump. But it isn't the way it used to be. It used to be a legitimate question. I think it still is, but I do think that the field of ufology can be parsed into the people who do science, the people who do serious philosophy and theology, and then there's occultism in whatever form it is. And unfortunately, people who don't read enough about it will draw one conclusion or the other. And you people like you get stuck in the middle. Yes, sir. You're basically asking if the terms for earth or dry ground are specifically generic, or that's an oxymoron. If they're generic enough to refer not just to the planet Earth. I think, to be honest, I don't think you can take that as a reference to other worlds, because you're really dealing with two words. Earth is Eretz in Hebrew. Ground is Adamah, related to Adam. Adam Adam was taken from the dust of the ground. They're just used over and over and over and over again just for the stuff we stand on, both of them. You talk about the lights shining on the earth or on the ground. I think to apply Occam's razor, if I can steal that, light is shining on me now. To have the light shine on ground, I think the most basic reading of that is that the lights are out there in the atmospheric sphere, wherever you want to put that, or however you want to parse that. I'm not a scientist, so I'm probably not saying it correctly, but they shine on the ground. And since Genesis 1 is about the creation of the heavens and the earth, singular, I think that's the best way to read it, that it's talking about this planet here. This is one of these moments where, do I say what I really want to say? The question is, there's this teaching that the Torah was dictated word for word from the mouth of God. And the question related to the issue of the possibility that there are Bible codes in the Torah, and has that changed? This is the essence of your question. Has that changed the way Jews and Christians look at the Torah? Is that what you're basically asking? Okay, what I'd really like to say is this: yeah, I've seen it change Jews and Christians. I've seen it make them silly, because this idea, I'll put it this way. Show me a person who believes in a Bible code, and I will show you a person that doesn't understand anything about the transmission of the Old Testament. And what I mean by that, it sounds harsh, but I think it's necessary to say it that way. We have thousands of manuscripts of the Old Testament, either in whole or in part. They do not all agree in every place. Dead Sea Scrolls, showed this abundantly. Yes, there's a high degree of transmission accuracy, high 90 percentile. There's nothing like Old and New Testament for textual transmission on the planet. It exceeds any piece of classical literature exponentially. But what that means is that if you're going to go with this idea that the Torah, you take out all the vowels and have this chain of letters, and then you feed it into the computer and you set parameters in the computer and it spits out blocks of text, and then you find meaningful combinations on that. You're only using one text. You're only using one manuscript, as it were. In the case of the Bible Code, they use the 1966 Koren edition of the Masoretic text. There are literally thousands of other manuscripts of the Torah that do not all agree in every letter with that text. So they arbitrarily picked a text, excluding all the other manuscript data, and if you add one letter or take one letter out, if there's a manuscript difference, it shifts the whole code. Not only that, but the scribes, the Masoretes, which is a scribal term, they actually produced a system of notes, footnotes, as it were. Since they were responsible for copying the Old Testament, every once in a while they would come across, a manuscript difference or something they just thought, boy, I remember seeing a manuscript a few years ago and it didn't have this letter in it. They were that good. They had the entire thing memorized, letter for letter. But what they would do is they would make notes when they suspected that there could be a problem in transmission. They wouldn't necessarily change it because it was the text of God, but they would at least tell you that there might be a problem here. We have those notes. It's called the Masorah. We actually have all that stuff, the textual remarks that they made. Bible Code doesn't incorporate any of that either. I could just go on and on about what the problem with the Bible Code is that the data set that they use is arbitrary and thus flawed from the beginning. Now, if you could somehow determine every letter from all the manuscripts, which ones are correct, which ones are not, and then feed that into a computer and you come out with meaningful combinations, that would be something to look at. But the problem is with the data set. And to be really honest with you, I think a lot of people, for whatever reason, and I think it's just our scientific culture, they seem to think that proves the inspiration of the Bible. And generations have come and gone, and people didn't need that. I don't think we need it now. To reduce the Bible to empirical number crunching and using a flawed data set at that, I think people just want to be able to somehow, quote, scientifically prove something that is providential. It's like proving there's a God. You can't do it one way, you can't disprove it the other way, and I think that's where it needs to be left. I just think it's a misguided pursuit. It's not that people are unspiritual or not intelligent. I just think it's misguided, and it's just affected people adversely in the way they look at Scripture.
Is it a free-for-all?
It is a free-for-all.
First of all, I'm glad to see there is a Dr. Nelson. I was looking around today, and I heard rumors that Hugh had proven that he did not exist.
And he had Nelson. Paul Nelson. Oh, got it.
Just winked out, just like that. 1 minute he was there, and the next. I do have a serious question. I've been, as you have, to many of these kind of colloquia, and I've seen and heard a lot of the questions and debate and discussion. But I must say that I was stunned, and I don't use that word lightly. I was absolutely stunned at your National Academy quote. If that is policy, and the Academy is a part of the U.S. federal scientific conglomerate, if that is policy, then free intellectual inquiry in this society is dead. And I would just like to know the depths of your revulsion to go along with mine when I saw that.
I think that it's offered as policy to the public, but like many such rules, violated regularly by scientists themselves. I would say the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, has taken similar policy standpoints that science is necessarily naturalistic, and that is their official stance. Now, what can one do with that, except to hope that the data will eventually talk back to science itself, and it will have to rethink that. But when I lecture on these topics at university settings, the debate often is not joined at the level of evidence, but rather my interlocutors go straight to that dictum: science must be naturalistic. And there's nothing more to say at that point.
In terms of the Cydonia debate, for the last, I'd say, 10 years, since we found what we thought was the equivalent of the smoking gun, the cliched smoking gun, as to why NASA ostensibly, in the words of McDaniel, has shown zero capability, competence, or scientific curiosity on the question. When we found Brookings, when we found this official document that was a NASA study back in '59, which basically questioned the role of scientists in terms of this kind of a discovery, when I was brought up, as you were, to imagine the role of scientists or to publish what they find. But for a government agency, when its ink is not even dry on the charter, to be questioning the role of scientists on this kind of discovery, to me was the red flag. But I must say that you have seen my Brookings and, topped it, because that dictum from the Academy is so insightful as to the problems that we have had. If you have a playing field where, by definition, by fiat, you cannot consider an intelligent model, then we're dead in the water.
Right.
The only thing, there's no amount of data, no amount, I have always had problems with Carl's extraordinary claims, because what that has done, and I said it in Omni magazine years ago, it introduced the subjectivity into what is supposed to be an objective process by evaluating one discovery over another as, well, this one's more extraordinary, and you wind up moving the goalposts. The critics of Cydonia constantly say, but your evidence is not extraordinary enough. You have to have more. We got to see more. And we get mission after mission and image after image and analysis after analysis, and it's never, ever, never enough. This statement from the Academy, to me, is so revealing of a political problem at the heart of the system. How do we combat it? What's the answer? Because I don't think enough data will ever mean anything in this political climate.
No, I think that if you are a philosophically committed naturalist, and Hugh, I know, has dealt with this issue as well, that in fact data ultimately are irrelevant. They cannot overturn a philosophical commitment to naturalism, come what may. My hope, though, is that there are ways of provoking people's intuitions about the possibility of intelligent causation that they in fact will be better than their philosophy, that while they may proclaim a dictum, their curiosity will get the better of them. And that's what I've seen actually in university settings where I debate these questions.
Yeah, and I'd be a little more optimistic, because the AAAS and the National Academy of Sciences is heavily weighted towards the biological sciences. And when you get into physics and astronomy, what you see is a unanimity that there really is something in the anthropic principle. And we measure the universe. It has all the arcs of design. Paul Davies summed it up this way: the evidence for design is overwhelming when we look at these cosmic characteristics. So at least at that end of the spectrum, where people are looking at the gross features of the universe on its largest scales, they already have come to a consensus
that there is design there, design that takes us beyond the natural to the supernatural. You also see that in the cosmology, how general relativity is now at the point of being the most exhaustively tested and best proven principle in all of physics, more so than many of our laws of physics. And at the core of general relativity, there are theorems that establish that there must exist a causal agent responsible for bringing the universe into existence, all of its matter, energy, and even the space-time that's associated with matter and energy into existence independent of matter, energy, space, and time. And last time I checked the Webster's dictionary, that's a supernatural causal agent. So at those two levels...
Well, it's an intelligent causal agent. I'm intrigued with Paul's idea of...
Well, I would argue it's
separating the
intelligent
supernatural.
and supernatural. Both would apply.
How do you define supernatural?
Well, anything that transcends matter, energy, space, and time...
That's supernatural.
That's supernatural. And see, the space-time theorems put the causal agent of the universe in that category.
What if I were to show you, which I can, the results of an experiment which transcend known space, time, and physics, and which absolutely is not supernatural?
What's your example?
God, funny you should ask. See if I can do this properly here. Many years ago, a physicist who was a graduate of MIT and Harvard and worked for Edwin Land, named Bruce De Palma, the brother of the famous Hollywood director Brian De Palma, did an experiment. It was so provocative, it took him until his death to even begin to understand what he thought he saw in the results. What he did was really, really simple. Now, Feynman, as you know, has said that the most revealing discoveries are the ones that are really simple. He took two spinning steel balls, like pinballs, and he put them in cups in a mechanical arrangement that allowed him to shoot them, eject them, at about a 30-degree angle from the vertical, simultaneously. One of them was spinning at 27,000 RPM, the other was not. And what he found, to his astonishment and bewilderment for over a decade, was that the spinning ball went higher, faster, and fell farther and faster than the non-spinning ball. When he took this to Edwin Purcell, you know, of course, who Purcell is. He was a major name in radio astronomy back in the 50s. In fact, didn't he do the seminal work at Harvard with the antenna that found the hydrogen emission from the galaxy?
No, but he was working on testing general relativity.
Okay, so he worked with Shapiro?
Erwin Shapiro's group.
Okay. Anyway, when Purcell was confronted with this, he basically said, I don't want to look at it, it will change everything. This experiment violates a lot of laws, including conservation. Where is the energy coming from? How is it manifest? This, by the way, there's a corollary. One of his students with an MD, I believe in Maryland, and this is published on the web, some years later took a sealed gyroscope from a Titan missile so that aerodynamics could not be involved, and dropped through sensitive diodes with computerized readouts so they could get time of flight and all that, the non-spinning gyro in the seal package and the spinning gyro. And the spinning gyro fell faster and quicker than the non-spinning gyro, in consonance with the second half, the downward arc of the spinning ball experiment. This is so revolutionary, this is so extraordinary, and no one in the literature, at Science or Nature or any university, to my knowledge, will touch it. When I was at the UN 10 years ago, 11 years ago, I put this out as a challenge to high school kids working at the UN.
International School, which is housed here at the UN, to be one of the first schools to try to do this in their physics lab.
To basically, in their school, in the physics lab, duplicate this experiment and tell the world what they found. No one will touch it. The teachers said, stay away. So this, to me, qualifies as a supernatural experimental result that obviously has a real physics cause, but it's beyond the current paradigm.
Well, it's only beyond the current paradigm if you can prove that it violates the second law of thermodynamics. So until you reach that point,
well, given your
it wouldn't
background,
be
can
fair.
you think of an explanation for why the spinning object will go higher and faster than the non-spinning one? Where is the energy coming from?
Well, there could easily be a transfer of energy from one frame to another frame. I mean, until you can rule that out, you haven't really violated
When you say
physics.
frame, what do you mean?
Well, in other words, you have different forces of physics that are responsible for different energy realms. If there's a trade from one to the other, then you haven't violated the laws of physics. And so that's what you need to do, is dig into this experiment a little deeper to see if there are any true violations, or are you simply trading conservation from one realm to another.
De Palma was trained, as I said, MIT, Harvard. He worked for Edwin Land, Polaroid. He was no slouch. He's unfortunately no longer with us. He did a lot of experiments. I mean, he did literally a couple of decades worth of experimentation with spinning systems and found all kinds of remarkable irregularities, exchange of momentum that was not, satisfied by the equal sign between collision before and collision after. So this is not an anomaly. This is an anomaly with a capital A. We believe, based on our work at Cydonia and the geometry that we found there, that we have a potential answer. But the answer not only confounds relativity, it confounds the energy conservation laws, and it introduces us to the idea of information transfer from a higher dimensional state space outside of the 3 dimensions of space and the one of time that we're all familiar with, which is in the realm that I think you told George the other night is the realm of demons and angels. If this is a real physics, as we have been contending based on our work, then I would say that that realm is no more supernatural than you and I having a conversation here. It simply is unexplored and unexplained, but it's not beyond explanation.
Well,
If I could interject, Dr. Ross, I do want to say I appreciate the question of dimensions coming up at this point. The brand new Scientific American that just came out has on their cover the question of 11 dimensions. Recent publications similar in nature talked about parallel universes. And so to talk about the question of what is supernatural, how we use that term, in terms of comparison to what is interdimensional, I think that's a very useful place to go. And I would appreciate Dr. Ross and anyone else addressing that.
Well, there's a book on the table that I wrote called Beyond the Cosmos, which looks at the 10-dimensional cosmic model that's popular among string theorists today. But we physicists look at that as part of the natural realm. We don't see that as being transcendent or supernatural, if for the simple reason that if you look at the dimensions of length, width, height, and time, there is not enough room, dimensional room within those 4 dimensions to fit in all the symmetries demanded by both quantum mechanics and gravity. Now, for you and I to be alive and talking to one another, gravity and quantum mechanics must coexist. Now, this was discovered 12 years ago by John Schwartz at Caltech.
But Einstein could never get gravity and quantum mechanics to coexist.
Well, it's because he was trying to make it work in 4 dimensions. John Schwartz started the research program to say, if we can't fit it into 4, we have to go to more. And it was at UC Santa Barbara about 5 years ago that a group of physicists, including a gentleman that volunteers for us, Jerry Cleaver, came up with a solution. It's a universe where you've got 4 large, rapidly expanding space-time dimensions, length, width, height, and time, accompanied by 6 extremely tiny dimensions that were rapidly expanding from the creation event, but stopped expanding when the universe was 10 to the minus 43 seconds old. Now, those 6 tiny dimensions still exist. In fact, everywhere in the universe, they're wrapped very tightly around the 4 big dimensions. Now, the real bonus that established the veracity of this model was the fact that when you came out with the 10-dimensional solution, it not only allowed quantum mechanics and relativity to coexist, but it predicted in the same form that Albert Einstein gave us. Pardon me, I was quantum mechanics and gravity coexisting, but the bonus that came from the solution from Andrew Strominger's team is that they got all the equations in special and general relativity as a completely unexpected bonus. So the fact that we can perform experiments that demonstrate the validity of both special and general relativity, now to 21 places of the decimal, establishes that the universe really is 10-dimensional in nature, and that's part of the natural system. It's not the transcendent or the supernatural. And so all the physics that we need fits within that.
We're back to definitions. So where are your demons?
My demons would be beyond the 10 space-time dimensions that would define the behavior of matter and energy.
Okay. So I would like, Richard, if we don't mind, if we could open this question about the possibility of multiple dimensions to the other speakers and give them an opportunity if they'd like to respond on that.
They just have to be aggressive.
We appreciate your assertiveness, Richard. Would any of the other three like to respond on the multiple dimensions?
I was kind of wondering about...
Can you hear me now?
I was sort of thinking along the lines of Richard's question that if there was some sort of violation of, 4 or 10 dimensions, if there was some sort of violation, wouldn't that just require a definitional change? Well, in other words, just because a new physics comes along doesn't mean that what we used to think of as supernatural is now a victim of that or is absorbed into the natural world.
Yeah, again, the physicists would define it as, that which is natural as that which is subject to the space-time dimensions of the universe and subject to the laws of physics that would rule in those now 10 space-time dimensions. Where you got to be careful with definitions, I noticed that cover piece was the 11 dimensions. And there are a number of what are called 11-dimensional cosmic models. But it really is a 10-dimensional fix. If I could just take a sheet of paper here. You can conceive of the universe as a 10-dimensional flat sheet. But what a number of cosmic models are doing, in particular the ekpyrotic models, is that they're conceiving of this 10-dimensional sheet.
Wait a minute, ekpyrotic?
Ekpyrotic means out of fire, right.
Okay.
Okay, I'll get to that in a minute. Okay, if you fold the 10-dimensional sheet like this, where you have one 10-dimensional sheet facing the other 10-dimensional sheet, that's called in the popular literature an 11-dimensional cosmic model. But it's simply a 10-dimensional sheet folded up like a U. But it does lead to some interesting possibilities that these two faces of the same 10-dimensional universe could be separated by very tiny distances. The models in this category predict that the two sheets would be less than 1 millimeter apart. So if you can conceive of this vast cosmos folded in on itself like such that there's two facing pieces just 1 millimeter apart, and if it's significantly less than 1 millimeter, it allows the possibility of a space-time quantum fluctuation rippling off one sheet, heading for the other, and if that were to happen, the whole thing would end in a fiery blast. And a number of physicists who are not Christians have made note of the fact that Peter speaks about this in his second letter. And likewise, you get Isaiah speaking about this in Jeremiah, how the universe will end like a scroll being wrapped up in a fiery heat. And a lot of them are saying, this sure looks like the ekpyrotic model of the universe.
Did you ever read Arthur Clarke's The 9 Billion Names of God?
I never read that.
Oh, it's a stunning short story, and he literally has at the end, it's set high in the Himalayas with a bunch of Tibetan monks, and they're doing prayer wheels, and they say that when they complete the 9 billion names, the universe will roll up like a scroll. And the guy who's a reporter who's gone to visit them and do the story and all that is walking down this kind of rocky crag at sunset, and he looks back and he sees the stars are winking out one by one.
Many of us have wanted to ask, what does Arthur Clarke know and when did he know it? Let me give it the opportunity to Dr. Nelson and to Dave also to respond to multiple dimensions if you have any responses you'd like to add to that.
No, I don't actually. I deal with the question of the definition of the supernatural on a much more mundane level. Typically, when you talk to someone who says
that's cute.
They don't, yeah, they don't understand the supernatural, you'll say, well, give me a definition of the supernatural. And they'll say, well, something that I can't explain in terms of, known physical laws. So then I say to them, well, explain to me how I do this. Right? I mean, somewhere up here, my mind is setting in chain a sequence of events that allow me to raise my arm to make a point. And we know that if we sever the nerve tract here, or even where the nerve comes out of the skull, I won't be able to do it. But no one has a clue. No one on earth has a clue how I set in chain, somewhere up here, that sequence of events. Now, is that supernatural, according to this definition? No. And yes, at the same time. Here it is, it's not supernatural, I'm just raising my arm. So it seems to me it's an incoherent notion. What makes much more sense to me is the idea of agency, that there are agents, intelligent beings, of greater and lesser degrees of power and ability. Michael Jordan, once upon a time, could jump from the free throw line, dunk a ball. I could never do that, ever. It's not supernatural, but it's clearly an ability beyond pretty much everybody in this room. Why not say that there's a range of agents all the way up to God himself with different ranges of abilities, and that this conception that we have
so
of
you're saying Michael has help?
Well, I mean, Jascha Heifetz playing a Mozart concerto, or Picasso sketching a woman. I mean, there are ranges of abilities.
This really bothers me because it's like you can change the rules to fit your cloth. Hugh made a big point the other night when he did George's show to put the occult and those that haunt the occult, the demon world, in a certain category of negativity and basically they're not out for our benefit, but they inhabit this supernatural realm. Here's another experiment. All right, this was done by De Palma. It involves, again, rotation. I mean, it used to be said that the 3 laws of business were, location, location, location. Well, the 3 laws of hyperdimensional physics are rotation, rotation, rotation. Because what you do in this experiment is you take a massive steel flywheel, and the numbers are all there, and you spin it up to about 8,000 RPM, and you put a West clock, a electric clock with a power source off camera, and an Accutron watch, the old Bulova Accutrons that had the little tuning fork that vibrated at 360 cycles per second. And the normal loss rate of the tuning fork was on the order of a quarter of a second a day. When this experiment was set up, and you can see the metal shield there, so there's no electrical interference, what De Palma got in 17 minutes was a 1-second loss. When the flywheel was not running, the Accutron performed as advertised. When the flywheel was running, again, no physical contact, it's merely in the vicinity of a spinning system, something is grossly changing the inertial properties of the tuning fork. In fact, he found that it was anisotropic. The tuning fork, oriented vertically in the flywheel vicinity, vibrated differently than the tuning fork operated horizontally. In fact, Accutron used to publish a little booklet with their watch that said that if the watch was in a vertical position, it would lose 4 seconds per day. If it wasn't on your wrist, normally roughly horizontal. So what De Palma felt was that he had tripped over something he called the odd field, because it was odd, and it actually had a Greek derivative, which I don't remember at the moment, but that it was somehow a connectivity thing with a dimension of space-time that allowed energy to permeate this reality and change certain physical constants. Now, to me, the quintessential example in the real world of De Palma actually being real was during the flight of Apollo 13. We all remember Apollo 13 back in 1970, I believe, where the astronauts almost bought the farm. They almost died as they looped up around the moon. They had an explosion. They had to do a crash burn to get home on a fast trajectory. I was at CBS working for Cronkite, and we covered the whole thing in meticulous detail. One of the weird things that happened is that they had to power down all of their systems, everything. It was the first space mission, either manned or unmanned, where they did not have any functioning electronics. And the one thing that they had to power down that they had never powered down before was something called the Inertial Measurement Unit, which was a system consisting of spinning gyroscopes and accelerometers that tell the computer what forces are acting on the spacecraft and which direction it's pointing so they can do navigation and ultimately do rocket burns and get home. That spacecraft operated in a marvelously bizarre fashion in its looping trajectory around the moon. They had to do several course corrections. Mission controllers could never explain to this day what was happening with the inertial properties in the gravitational field of the Earth-Moon system. And what I look at, as I look at De Palma's experiment, I look at the fact that they powered down, I think this may, okay. They had to power down the spinning systems, and what De Palma found is that even in the vicinity of a small gyro, the rapid movement of the whole system is affected. And therefore there's a transfer into the properties of space-time in this set of dimensions. That is not supernatural. That is a physics we don't currently entertain.
But it's also a physics that's not yet validated.
Well, the mission flight people on Apollo 13 ruled out, gaseous products, urine.
Now, what I'm getting at is if there's actually something to what you're saying, we astronomers would be able to easily validate that with our hydrogen maser clocks. And what we're seeing when we do long baseline interferometry, everything is...
Funny you should mention that.
Yes.
There's another experiment. He brought an ordinary FM receiver, solid-state FM receiver. You got them, every home in America has them. He brought it near the spinning flywheel. The frequency of the receiver changed by 300 cycles per second at a distance of 6 inches. And it was repeatable. Now, he's not with us. He's dead. But what I want to challenge you, and to a lesser degree Paul, to do is to help me conduct laboratory experiments that either prove or disprove this set of seminal, groundbreaking experiments and find out what is going on, because there is a supernatural realm that I think we need to explore.
Well, if there's anything to your claims, it'd be easy to get a physics lab to do it.
They were De Palma's experimental results.
So it shouldn't be that difficult to, I mean, this is what Physics Letters B is all about, is trying to publish these kinds of possibilities.
You have to have a laboratory to do this work.
Right. That shouldn't be a big deal if there's any validity to these claims.
Okay. So you'll help me get a lab,
confirming
right?
it would be no big deal.
You'll help me get a lab.
I can't help you get a lab. I don't have funding. On the other hand...
you know people at Caltech.
I do.
You teach at Caltech.
Right.
Well, I can travel to Caltech.
No, but the first thing you got to do is convince the physics community that the experiment's worth doing.
Are you intrigued?
Not really, because
Gosh,
there's
why am
enough
I not
anomalies in
surprised?
here. No, seriously, I mean, I would want to know what's behind the experiment. Has it been misinterpreted? What are the controls? I mean, I would be concerned about the fact that we do have experiments going on that indicate that the passage of time is extremely reliable when we do our astronomical research. Does this mean that just this lab is the anomaly? What about the rest of the universe? So it's questions like that that must be answered before you're going to persuade anybody to spend any money. You have to prove to them that you actually have an anomalous effect here that isn't simply an artifact.
Does this look expensive?
Well, I mean, I don't know how much it costs.
Flywheel, spinning balls, I mean, is that expensive? Clocks?
Well, clocks are expensive. The good clocks are. So.
But you can borrow anything.
Richard,
Yeah,
I'm going to ask you, Richard, to keep working on Dr. Ross later, and let's move on with the discussion at this point. But I appreciate what you've brought up to us. David, did you want to respond to a point of the conversation?
I want to get back. I was kind of surprised by your definition of supernatural and the realm that demons occupy. And if I heard you right, you said they exist outside of natural, understood, conventional physical law or dimension.
Yeah, that's not quite what I'm defining.
I might have heard you wrong then.
Well, I mean, we talked about this on Coast to Coast AM, is that the Bible's point about angelic beings, whether they be fallen angels or righteous angels, is they are beings that are not confined to the space-time realm of the universe, but they can enter into it. And they can manifest themselves in ways that would have physical consequences. I mean, when you read the pages of the Bible, you actually have angels eating physical food. They're engaging in sleep. So they're not confined like we human beings are to the laws of physics in the space-time realm, but they can choose to enter in and leave.
Yeah, that raised a question in me then. I was noticing how maybe Western biased this whole panel is. And if we had somebody from the East, Buddhism, and they talked about perception and their views of how things actually can be changed from watching them when it comes to the interaction between human and divine, and that actually the perception of a divine being is still a physical event for the person who's seeing it. I mean, there actually is, like you were saying, an insertion of something that comes from one dimension to another. And they're able to realize that. But I wanted to pin down exactly what you were talking about, because if you blur the line of a created being moving outside a dimension to the point where they're not even part of it, I think that you're getting into the idea of omnipotence, things that God only possesses. And some people actually will ascribe to, say, Satan as having equal anti-power with God, even though he was a created being and he was...
Well, I think Paul already defined that for us when Paul made the point that you have God, this omnipotent being, who fills the entirety of his creation, but is also completely transcendent to his creation. And then between him and human beings, if I read you right, there's a gradation. There are angels that are more powerful than other angels, more capable.
How do you define capable?
Well,
I mean, if you can do magical things, where does the magic stop?
I think look at this.
They can only go 10,000 times the speed of light, not 20?
Well, look at the people in this room. Let's just stay with the mundane distribution of abilities among Homo sapiens. There are people in this room who can solve differential equations that I can't solve. And it's not that hard for them to do that. There are people in this room, Mike Heiser, for instance, who can read ancient languages that I can't read and will never be able to read. Now, it's clear that among intelligent beings, there are gradations of ability and capability. It's not mysterious, it's just we're agents and we have different abilities. So I don't see why there should be any puzzle about there being a hierarchy of beings along which there's a distribution of different causal powers. Is that puzzling to you in any way?
Well, I wanted to, related to that, it almost sounds, Dr. Ross, I'm sure there's somebody wondering out there, how can you have a created being who exists, not just is able to do certain things, but exists outside the properties of creation, okay, outside of physical properties? Because in theology it seems that we're used to, and it doesn't make it right, but we're used to assuming that only God occupies that area. That only, one of the definitions, one of the definitional properties of what God is that he is outside of his creation. He is outside of these physical processes. So to put anything else there and yet call it created, a created being, seems like it doesn't work.
Yeah, I think the distinction is this, is that God alone is omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient. Satan, the most powerful of God's angels, according to the Bible, does not have any of those properties.
But they're still created beings.
They're still created beings, but they are geographically limited. They're temporarily limited. God is neither geographically nor temporarily limited, but the angels are. Now, the geographical and temporal limits are not as confining as ours. That's just according to Christian theology. Christian theology states
that agrees with the historical record too. When you talk about what the Greeks actually, would qualify as being theos or demios, they actually had. I'm not saying demios, right? Daemon, something like that. But there was gradations in their belief system, and they were always non-human, and they were always, within echelons. They were in conflict with each other at times too.
And by the way, I see this experiment up here. Mm-hmm. We know there's something wrong with that. because in astronomy we can measure the radiometric decay rates throughout the entire universe, showing that for the...
You know, the thing that bothers me about you is you're so damn certain.
Well,
you remind me of my old priest, Father Flanagan, who was so damn certain.
And Richard, I'm going to ask if we can avoid making it personal and keep it to a theoretical question, okay? A theoretical question, not a personal
Well, there's a reason why astronomers express this kind of certainty. I'll give you one. One is the anthropic principle. In order for life to exist at a physical level, certain constants and laws must remain constant for the entire age of the universe. Otherwise, we wouldn't even be here, like the velocity of light, for example, like the radiometric decay constants. You have them vary at any time, we wouldn't be here.
Well, this experiment showed that radiometric decay is not constant.
Second point. We can actually
don't
observe.
Pass that up.
No, I'm saying there's something must be fundamentally wrong with this experiment.
See, now that's a religious perspective.
No, it's a scientific perspective.
No, it's a religious perspective. When you see a result that conflicts with your database, it's got to be wrong because you know what's right.
Okay, either the astronomers are wrong about the universe and their observations, or there's something wrong in this experiment. They both can't be right.
And how many times have astronomers been wrong in recorded history?
Well, they've been wrong, but keep in mind you're asking them to discount all their database.
No.
Because we can measure radiometric decay in stars and galaxies all over the universe. And so when you try to challenge, what you have to say is that, you know, there's something wrong with their spectral results, not just in a few stars and galaxies, but millions of stars and galaxies. Now, again, extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence.
No, they do not.
If you're saying that we're going to have to throw away our whole database, you need more than one experiment.
What I'm hearing Dr. Ross say is that you would want to evaluate the apparatus. It's got that's the term that jumps out at me there, run-through apparatus. And I'm hearing Dr. Ross say, going back to Paul Nelson's approach, evaluating all the possible natural causes before Dr. Ross would be willing to accept this. Am I understanding that correctly?
That's correct, particularly in the fact that we are all here.
Okay.
I mean, this is in contradiction with the fact that we have life in the universe. It also contradicts the observations that we astronomers have about the universe. So that would give me some powerful motivation to look for some experimental flaw in the system.
As opposed to look for why it might be true.
Well, I'm prepared to look for why it might be true, but then I'm going to have to explain why am I even here, and why are the stars and galaxies behaving the way they are. So in other words, there's either got to be some big misperception about nature that we physicists have, or there's something...
And that's never happened before.
Well, not at that scale. I mean, when you're asking...
Of course it's happened. Absolutely. Flat as a pancake.
I'd like to interject at this point that I appreciate Richard's emphasis of drawing attention to the hyperdimensional physics model, and I certainly encourage anyone who has not read the papers on the Enterprise Mission website on hyperdimensional physics to read them. They are excellently produced, and they have a lot of historical data to back them up. I'm wondering if it would be appropriate to shift the discussion at this point in time and in more of a reflection of what the conference has addressed already during the day. I'm wondering, for example, if you would like to address each other about the photographic evidence that Richard presented, the historical, mythological, architectural evidence that David presented. Would you like to ask each other questions about what you heard from each other already during the day?
Well, I'm going to ask two because I probably won't get another chance.
I wonder what he means by that.
Okay. Here's the twofold question. It's mostly for Dr. Ross and for Dr. Nelson. One is, if Richard is correct, if there are anomalous structures on Mars that show intelligence, how might the intelligent design movement use that? And the second one is, Dr. Ross, you made a comment to me last night at supper that I found really interesting, and that was about your observation from the literature that the idea of directed intelligent panspermia has grown within the scientific community, and non-directed panspermia has sort of been quashed. So I'm throwing both of those out, again, because I just want to do it now. And either one is fine. I'm curious about both of those things. What do you think is motivating the growth in directed panspermia, or at least the willingness to consider that? And how might the intelligent design community use some of this if it happens to be true?
Sure. Well, my colleague, Dr. Fuzz Rana, a biochemist, and I have been attending the Origin of Life conferences that are held every 3 years, just to kind of see how these researchers are dealing with the database. And the thing we've observed is that they're recognizing that we can't solve the origin of life from a naturalist perspective on planet Earth. There isn't time, there's no soup, you got the oxygen ultraviolet paradox, and therefore they've been looking on Mars, Europa, Titan, but they're also showing that those sites have even worse problems for the origin of life, and then therefore they've gone to panspermia.
This is the Francis Crick model.
Well, no, Francis Crick has directed panspermia. What you've been bringing up here is the lower issue, which is natural panspermia. This is the idea that prebiotics in interstellar clouds got transported to planet Earth somehow.
Or cometary material.
Cometary material, asteroidal exchange from one planetary system to another planetary system. And particularly the last Origin of Life conference really nailed that if you're talking gas or dust, it's not going to work, because the gas and dust particles are so small that they're going to be exposed to ultraviolet radiation and heat as they pass through the Earth's atmosphere. So this is not a vehicle for getting the necessary prebiotics to the surface of the Earth, which left open the remaining possibility that it's a rock. That if you have a rock, then it could survive the ultraviolet radiation, although one researcher pointed out the rock must be at least 2 meters across, because there will be radiation penetration through the outer 1.5 meters of the rock. So it's got to be a fairly big rock. But in the interior of that rock, you could have these protected prebiotics.
Last year, Wickrama Singh published a paper on microorganisms collected by high-altitude aircraft or balloons above the tropopause that appeared to be alien. And I think he published it in Nature, I think, claiming that this was evidence in his mind of panspermia. We were sweeping up small micron-sized organisms from interplanetary space, and they didn't know where they came from, but he said this is how life got seeded on the Earth from the Earth environment in the solar system.
Yeah,
and this
he
was
and
the current
Fred
proof.
Hoyle have been promoting that idea for the last couple of decades. If you want to read a good response to that, Robert Shapiro's published some papers.
Okay.
And his point is that the claim is based on spectra. The spectra look a lot like the spectra you would get from dead bacteria.
I thought they actually had morphologies. They actually had organisms in the gels and under microscopes or microphotography. They actually could see very different looking little guys.
Well, they have that in the so-called, they have that kind of evidence claimed in the Martian meteorites.
No, but I'm talking about the dust they picked up in the high atmosphere that they claim couldn't get up from the Earth. In other words, there's no transport mechanism to shoot these little microorganisms at that altitude.
Yeah, I've heard no claim that they've got microfossils in the dust.
Well, let me send you a paper.
And one of the things about microfossils, this is what killed the Martian meteorite claim, is that the fossils must be a minimum size in order to be hallmarks of life. The microfossils that were in the because you need room to put the proteins in.
But we've got the same similar nanobacteria here.
Yeah, but the nanobacteria must be at least 200 nanometers across to even hold a ribosome, let alone the other required.
We have samples here that are equivalent to what they claimed for the Martian meteorite.
I don't think that that's I think that all those results are equivocal.
Yeah, I don't know anyone that's seriously claiming that today.
I was suggesting that there are samples here of living microorganisms that are that small, that contain enough information to operate a biochemical system. So the major problem that they used to have, that they were too small on Mars and the meteorite, has now gone away. There are other problems.
That's not the literature I read.
Well,
You can read astrobiology. They've been publishing several papers on this, and there really is a consensus in the NASA astrobiology community that the microfossil evidence is not valid. But back to my main point about the panspermia, is that if you're talking dust or gas, that will not bring in the prebiotics without being destroyed. And therefore, they're now claiming a rock. But Jay Melosh, about 9 months ago, published a paper in the scientific literature where he calculated the probability of a rock. This is a relatively small rock. He wasn't talking the 2-meter guys, but even just the tiny rocks. The probability of getting one rock from one planetary system to another planetary system, or from a molecular cloud to a planetary system, was that you would get one such rock delivered every 10 to the 16 years. And so with the universe only being 10 to the 10 years, we realize that natural panspermia cannot be the answer to the origin of life on planet Earth. And this is what motivated the researchers at the last 2 Origin of Life conferences to say, well, if we can't make it happen on Earth, we can't make it happen in the solar system, we can't make it happen anywhere else in our galaxy or any other galaxy, then the right answer has got to be directed panspermia. In other words, spaceships sent by intelligent aliens purposely seeding life on planet Earth. And this is what's motivated me to write this chapter in my book, that if you're talking spaceships bringing life forms, then you've got a space travel problem. That regardless of technology, if these beings are subject to the laws of physics, they simply wouldn't have the capacity to salt the Earth by that means.
Unless they go through another dimension.
Well, if you're talking a supernatural being, not a problem.
Not supernatural. Physics we don't currently understand. You know, it is so easy to invoke supernatural. It's almost like what I see in your equations and all those 202. By the way, why did you stop at 202?
Oh, we plan to we're adding about a factor of 1 billion every 6 months to the odds.
Anyway,
so it's getting more and more remote.
The point that bothers me about all that is it's so incredibly theoretical. I mean, I don't detect any humility at all in you. And I'm not being personal, all right?
New definitions being presented this evening.
And when I say humility, I don't see you once saying, but I might be wrong.
Well,
I will instantly say about this that I might be wrong.
No, Richard, what you had heard me say is I'm willing to put my model to the test. In other words, if I am wrong, then as the scientists learn more and more about the universe, we're going to see this evidence for fine-tuning and design gradually go away. But if my paradigm is correct, I would expect in the next 6 months that the evidence will grow stronger for my position, not weaker, and I'm willing to let the future scientific discoveries determine whether I'm right or wrong. That's what I call true scientific humility, being willing to accept what the data tells you and be willing to stick your neck out, make the appropriate predictions, and I'm willing to hang myself in my predictions. But I expect everybody else to do the same thing.
To follow that about the directed panspermia, theological question. Why is it just going back to the refusal at that point, at this point of defeat or desperation for non-directed panspermia? Is it just really that simple that they just don't want to believe in an intelligent creator in terms of God? That now we have directed panspermia and there can't be any other possibility?
Well, I'm kind of encouraged by this development, Mike, because I see them as getting closer and closer to what I believe is the right answer. They started off with a naturalist process on planet Earth, then they moved to Mars and Europa and Titan, then they went out to the star systems, panspermia got knocked out. Now they're saying it's directed panspermia, intelligent beings. And I'm saying let's just one step removed from what I believe the real answer is, supernatural, transcendent, directed panspermia. So I'm encouraged.
And how would you test the difference?
How would you test the difference? Okay. If we're talking natural, directed panspermia, intelligent beings on another planet transporting this stuff here, well, they would have to make quite a few trips to explain the history of life on planet Earth. Would they have the capability of doing that within the laws of physics? I've already argued that that door is closed. So in that sense, I think if you want to push the directed panspermia hypothesis, if you're talking beings subject to the laws of physics and the space-time dimensions of the universe, they're not going to be able to pull it off. Moreover, as you heard me mention in my talk, you've got the longevity problem. Beings that are intelligent and civilized and technological have a limited lifespan. They will go extinct. And the more technologically advanced they are, the more rapidly they go extinct. Moreover, we realize that it takes a certain minimum time in order for the universe to possibly harbor intelligent beings. Well, I mentioned Brandon Carter. I mean, there's been several books written, not just Brandon Carter. Frank Tipler's written a book on this.
But how
John
do
Barrow.
they know?
Okay.
We're stuck on one fly speck out of 400 billion fly specks in this galaxy alone.
Yeah.
We're stuck here.
But two of the 51 characteristics of the universe that must be fine-tuned to allow for carbon-based life is the universe must be exceptionally homogeneous and uniform. And as we astronomers observe the universe, we see that borne out. As we look at all the galaxies, they obey this uniformity, homogeneity requirement. There's no special chemistry elsewhere in the universe. There's this homogeneity. So the fact that we observe it and the fact that we know it's necessary just to explain the existence of life.
Wait. The other day I saw a paper. They've been looking at globular clusters, 47 Tucanae, and they were looking for the same kind of planets that the guys, Marcy and what's his name in San Francisco, have found in our neighborhood, just across the street. And they found nothing.
Right.
And then they found a planet. Hubble actually got a visual shot of the white dwarf of this strange binary system with a planet. I think it's about 10 or 15 times Jovian mass, orbiting in a very long orbit around both stars. And the problem is that the metallicity, to use your term, the amount of heavy substances above helium and hydrogen, is way down compared to the solar standard. Now, what this shows us is that our standard model for how you get planets that you can walk on is wrong.
Okay.
They were somehow able, this planet somehow was able to
You can
form.
go to our website, and in our Creation Update archives, you can see a program that we did on that very discovery. And you can get the paper. It was published in Nature. And what the authors will tell you in that Nature publication is that this was a star that had migrated from the center of the globular cluster out to the edge. And when it got to the edge, it captured this body. There was an unusual interface.
But that's a theory.
No
one saw it happen.
No,
it's a model.
But it's a model that's well borne out by the dynamics that we observe.
And there's another guy that says that model's all wet and my model is true.
No,
Yes.
I haven't seen that paper.
I'll
I mean, I
send it
follow
to
the
you.
literature. You can show me the paper.
The point
However,
is that it's opinion.
No, it's more than
you
opinion.
give the impression, there was a guy in the British Patent Office who in the last century basically said that we just can close the patent office because all the good things to be invented have been invented. And of course that was before, Bill Gates. The fact is that knowledge is open-ended. We learn something like twice what we used to know. The total sum of human knowledge doubles. It used to be every 7 years, now it's down to 5 or 4. The total sum won't fit in my computer. The point is that you are so certain about things that I am so uncertain about, and I'm as fully cognizant of a lot of this literature as you are.
Well, the certainty isn't unique to me. I mean, just the example
there's enough
about
universe to go around.
the example of that globular cluster. I mean, what you're talking about is celestial mechanics. It's just Newton's laws of motion applied to the dynamics
The problem
of the
is in
system.
a globular cluster, we don't have the algorithms to competently do anything with celestial mechanics at all. Read Nightfall by Isaac Asimov.
Well, I mean, you're talking a two-body problem, and you know that if you've got two bodies revolving around one another, you can solve the
but the migration
differential
of a free
equations.
planet through the heart of a globular cluster, there's like dozens per cubic parsec. The gravitational fields alone make it an impossible calculation. Impossible.
I'm not claiming there aren't other possible models to explain the phenomena, but
Oh
the
my
one
God.
that's got the highest
hear that?
probability. Hold it.
Did you hear that?
No,
Richard, you got your
Richard?
concession that hyperdimensional physics might be worth looking at.
no, hold it.
But do give Dr. Ross an opportunity to respond on the
Right.
data.
What I'm saying is the most probabilistic scenario for this event is a star that moved from the center of the globular cluster out to the edge, had a capture event take place at that edge, and then moved back in towards the center. They can actually see the thing drifting in towards the center. Now, the metallicity would be well explained by the position of this globular cluster. It's in a high metallicity part of our galaxy. So you've got this old globular cluster, low metallicity, but it resides in a very high metallicity region of our galaxy. And with this star moving out towards the edge of the globular cluster, it has a high probability of capturing one of these high metallicity stars and then dragging it into the center of the globular cluster. So it's not at all a violation of what astronomers understand.
But it's a series of assumption on assumption on assumption on assumption. What I see in your list of 202 is a much longer list of assumption on assumption. It's like the standard Drake equation. In Monuments, I have a whole chapter on the Drake equation where, this is the standard equation that Frank Drake dreamed up as to how many aliens there could be out there. And what he had to do was to assume, how rapidly stars are born and how many planets a given star system will have and the probability that life will evolve, et cetera, et cetera. Each one of those unknowns was an unknown. They could guess, but they really didn't know. We're still in the guessing stage. We know almost nothing. Look at the whole dark energy thing. Well, if you want to see a revolution in cosmology, which is
with reference to Frank Drake, I would agree with you that many of the steps in the equation are just simply wild guesses. But there's two steps in his equation that are no longer wild guesses. One is the probability of finding a life support planet. The second would be the origin of life. Now, those are the two initial steps in the Drake equation. Given that those are extremely improbable, we don't have to worry about the other factors in the Drake equation.
We have no observational data. We have an example of one. This place, one.
No,
you can't do statistics on one.
Oh, as you saw, we now have 122 planets observed outside.
And they're all Jupiters.
Not all of them. Some of them are as small as a few times the mass of the Earth. Some of them are a third the mass of Saturn.
There is nothing down at that mass level. Our technology can't see them. We are looking at Doppler shifts on Jovian mass planets.
No, that's one technique only. The transit method.
There are only two planets that I know around pulsars that are of terrestrial mass, and a pulsar is a dead star, so it doesn't
that's
count.
True.
Does not count. There's no main sequence stars where we found Earth-sized planets with any known technology.
Well,
now, Planet Finder, Kepler, the NASA plans for the next decade or so, they will be able.
Double gravitational lenses with current technology can pick up Earth-sized planets today. One that they have seen measures between an Earth mass and 7 or 8 Earth masses. So that's getting down to a low size.
Can you send me that paper?
Yeah,
Doug, if I could interrupt,
yes,
if I could moderate a little bit. I'd like to hear, Paul, about my second question about if there is something anomalous on Mars, how if the intelligent design community had to respond, how would they do it? How would this help?
I think it would be a true conundrum, or put it this way, it would be as much of a dismaying discovery as an exciting discovery. Exciting in the sense that it would show our ability to detect non-human intelligence. Dismaying in the sense that many intelligent design theorists see the cosmos as fine-tuned for human life in particular. Mm-hmm. And if it turned out that we could give no reasonable scenario for the origin of these structures in terms of Homo sapiens, then that fine-tuning strictly for Homo sapiens, I think, would be in real trouble. So ever since you asked the question, I've been running scenarios through my mind of how people would respond, and I think they would be really head over heels. Head over heels.
Do you think it would be like a Galileo sort of level event, or?
I imagine the New York Times headline, "Extraterrestrial Intelligent Life Discovered," and it would not fit on the front page. It would be an event rivaling anything in the history of our species. in terms of its significance. I think, talk about high risk, high payoff ventures. The search for extraterrestrial life is one such enterprise.
But not as long as the National Academy Directive is in place. It can't happen, can it?
Well, quite a few JPL scientists and astrobiology scientists participate in our church. They come to our meetings. And the thing I've noticed is that they're very pro what you're after. They would love nothing more than to come up with evidence that there's some intelligent activity on the surface of Mars or somewhere else in the solar system. So
Why is that, Dr. Ross? Why are they motivated in that direction?
Well, they're motivated because their whole astrobiology program is predicated on the search for life outside of planet Earth, whether it be intelligent or primitive. Their funding has gone up 4 times in the last 5 years.
The astrobiology program is cited at NASA Ames. JPL is not seriously looking for
I'm
life.
talking about NASA in general.
As a whole.
I think NASA as a whole would be thrilled if you were right. I mean, they're not against you. They're hoping you're going to be right.
Would you like some data? As opposed to theory?
No, my whole point is the fact that NASA is skeptical, I think, must be examined.
No, this transcends skeptical. When I was invited by Lynn Bondurant, who was the director of education, to present to NASA Lewis, one of the NASA centers, I've been invited to present to NASA scientists, the rank and file, 5 times in the history of this investigation. Walking in the front door, red carpet treatment, full lab, high-level lunch, VIPs, the only thing he didn't do was the black Cadillac. So Lynn Bondurant, who was the guy who was in charge of the education program at NASA Lewis, invited me twice to present the Cydonia data to NASA Lewis before it was changed to the John Glenn Research Center there in Cleveland. At the second invitation, which was a convocation of teachers from all over the United States, he surprised me by telling the assembled crowd that they were going to do a satellite television series on the Cydonia question, and they decided that they could think of no more fitting name than Hoagland's Mars. That's where the title came from on our tape series, because it was NASA, Lynn Bondurant, who said, this is what we're going to call it. No sooner had they made that announcement than JPL, our dear friends at JPL, called up NASA headquarters, furious, seething, demanded that they rein in Bondurant. Headquarters called Bondurant, demanded he get on an airplane. He called me absolutely shocked. I mean, he was a 30-year NASA veteran. He was being treated like a whipped poodle. They made him go to Washington to take the notes, the tapes, the videos, whatever. The program died. His career was thrown in the ash can, all because JPL did not want a NASA program for PBS on the subject of Cydonia. So I have been there. I know what the reality is, the facts, not theory, and NASA would sooner walk into Saddam Hussein's lair than they would admit that this might be real.
And Richard, I would assume you would say that the McDaniel report continues to provide substantiation for that. And as we close the panel discussion, I'm curious if Dr. Ross, Dr. Nelson would have any response to the ideas that were presented from the McDaniel report today in terms of, is this legitimate peer review in terms of NASA's behavior as well as the independent researchers' quality of their research?
I'm too new to this subject to have a qualified opinion. I'm sorry.
Oh, come on, don't sit on the fence.
Well, I'll jump in.
I've been, for the last 2 weeks, I've been reading you, Paul, and you're not a fence sitter, all right? I've been reading a lot of your papers. Give us your opinion on this so far.
Well, look, science is inherently conservative, and there are good reasons for that. You don't want to chase after every wild hare. I have, in my own interactions in the university setting, have seen people say one thing in front of an audience and another thing at a bar over a beer. That's the social reality of science, and I think some of what I heard today reflects some unhappy social realities about the way that anomalous data are evaluated. But Richard, beyond that, I really don't want to say, because I'm just learning about this. So I need more time to study.
based
So
on...
we'll give Dr. Ross the concluding comment on that. David, did you have a comment?
Based on what you saw today in Richard's lecture and also what I showed, how much merit do you actually assign to that? I mean, the historical, theological view that I pervade. It's, it really seems like there's a lot of Judeo-Christian anchor there, because it doesn't conflict with the historical record. There's a lot of historians in ancient times who would say that the earth is extremely old and humanity's been here for, many thousands of years, which flies in, contemporary Christian thought, in the face of contemporary Christian thought. But when it comes to how there must have been some sort of interaction with heaven and a continuum from that early point till now, I mean, that's scripture also.
Yeah, there's a little bit of scripture on it, which is why there's so much speculation amongst theologians on this. We're looking at Genesis 6:2 and 4, the sons of God came down and married the daughters of men, and the Nephilim were the end product of it. You read on in the Bible, and you got King David's mighty men eliminating the last of the Nephilim. And as you point out, you look in Greek mythology, and it speaks of these giants, these heroes of old. It's not just the Bible that's making these kinds of claims. But in the context of the Christian perspective on this, for the last 3,000 years, there hasn't been any of these, quote, visitations. And exactly what form these visitations are, I can think of at least 3 different positions on this. Anyone's interested, I have a chapter in this in the Genesis question where I lay out the 3 different Christian positions on this issue. So I'm not in any way opposed to some of the suggestions that you're making. I am a skeptic, however, that there's any evidence of intelligent activity on Mars, for example. I'm certainly
That's what I was waiting for, basically.
Right. And I would just encourage people to go to the NASA websites. I've got a folder.
Well, is that a serious comment?
Yes, it is. I mean,
have you ever heard of the term conflict of interest?
Well, I would argue that their conflict of interest goes the other way. They're more motivated to support your position rather than refute it. I mean,
have you read Brookings?
I have not read Brookings, but I have seen the JPL and NASA photos, and you can go to their website, look at them for yourself. By the way, it isn't just the face on Mars. They'll show you a heart. They'll show you a butterfly. I mean, there's all kinds of things you can look at. But the question is there any substantial evidence that these are anything other than, say, the man in the rock in New Hampshire? Now, again, this is testable, and I think you and I would be willing to just let the future experiments and missions to Mars tell us what's happening.
I'm pushing. That's why we went to the Europeans. That's why I'm very pleased that Dr. Newcomb said that Cydonia will be a priority with that technology. We now need to get him to commit to the right times, because we know now that the time to do this is at grazing incidence light, when you get scattering phenomenon that you're not going to get with high incidence sunlight like we've had from Viking and Mars Surveyor.
Just to give my opinion on this, the high resolution photos don't seem nearly as impressive as the low resolution photos. And so I would say...
Hugh, a high resolution photo of you would not be impressive either.
Well, probably.
Nor me. This is what we call the Gigi phenomenon. Have I been standing up too close or back too far? Right. Or more colloquially, if you really go up and look at the Mona Lisa to where you're seeing the paint strokes, it doesn't look like the Mona Lisa. A work of art is designed to be seen at an optimum distance, and we may have exceeded the optimum distance. Now, the next step up in that scale will be Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter, the mission in 2005, which will have literally the resolution to see something the size of this book. At that resolution, we will see girders. Structural elements. Constructions, if they exist.
Well,
and that's what I'm looking for.
Tell you what, Richard, if we see the girders, you will convince me. But what if there are no girders?
There we go.
Will you be convinced?
Why don't we make a bet We'll think of something suitable, and if you win, I will pay up, and if I win, probably a dinner somewhere in L.A. I would think that would be appropriate.
No, that sounds appropriate, and that's really how science is done. I mean, we basically bet one another.
The secret comes out.